Hello, my name is Emilio, and today I'm going to be talking with a friend about a project of his. Care to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Xander, and I am the creator of High School Death Party.
Tell us a little bit about it before we get going.
High School Death Party is a your average typical sitcom about a child growing up in the Nether world because he is the son of the Grim Reaper.
Very nice. So, I guess to begin, what is the origin point for this, like, as a project of yours? Like, what is your the nucleus of it essentially?
Um, as far as what
Like, at
would
least the
have
base stages of like what it became to be.
It's kind of a hard question as it's been a very long-standing project that I've worked on probably well over a decade at this point. It's kind of taken many forms. Um,
At
I
the
guess it was
very
just
least,
always.
I'll say like what are your like first memories of like this beginning as like it's like very rough before it became like your first idea of it? Like any specific memories,
Um,
experiences that were like this could be inspiration for something later on.
I suppose inspirations tended more on just enjoying things like Adam's Family, Munsters, things like that, and wanting to make something similar. And in its very original incarnation, it was starring the Grim Reaper, and the more I went on, I thought it would have been a funnier approach to make it the son of the Grim Reaper, as at the time I hadn't really seen anything that had done that. Now, of course, there are a couple other things that have done something similar, but at the time I thought it was original. So
Yeah, so I guess like as a kid there was a lot of like horror, not straight up horror, but horror adjacent media, I guess adjacent media that you liked and that you wanted to do something in that vein.
yes.
I see. Were there any other like kind of I guess like when you were thinking of this project, what were some of the things that like you liked as part of your taste that kind of like went into it?
Well, again, I was always enjoy things like Adam's Family, Munsters. I think another one that probably more inspired it as far as the tone would have been the show Aural Monsters from Nickelodeon, as well as just sort of the more like certain levels from video games that were more horror, Halloween, spooky kind of oriented. One in particular I remember being from the Game Boy game Super Mario Land 2. And the area in that was very Halloween themed was something that inspired me at a younger age, and just I found it just captivating as a whole.
So I guess like even when you were a kid, you always liked that kind of like aesthetic as something that you would look
Well,
for.
it's interesting because I actually did and didn't. It's as funny as it seems. When I was younger, I was actually very easily scared. I you would have troubles with having nightmares just from like looking at like box art of like horror movies. But in its own right, it was always something that still captivated me. I guess in a means to want to get over it. It was something just I don't know the term perverse, but it was just a perverse fascination
Unorthodox.
of liking it despite the fear in it. But I also enjoyed when it was something that was less horror oriented. Again, just things like the boos from Mario Brothers, or things that were it kind of took the fear out of it and just made it something more fun and enjoyable. And I guess just it was something just to try and enjoy the whole aspect of it, because again, it was something I was very easily scared younger. Now it's very
So
different now.
essentially, what it was that when you were a kid, you did like a lot of stuff that I guess is like macabre, like not full on horror, but very much inspired by it and meant to be enjoyed. And then later, the more
Yes,
genuine horror came. I would guess, like as
yes,
you got older.
yes, as well as a mixture of just always kind of having a more sarcastic, kind of dark sense of humor.
Yeah, I could see that where like it was kind of like taking. I mean, for me, I think the comic is kind of this middle ground of like again what you said, very macabre, kind of grim humor with like a lot of like more absurd surrealism.
Exactly.
So like I could see both of those like at play. So was it a case of like you had those set inspirations that were kind of the bases, then later on you got new stuff like over time it kind of like it developed with your taste basically.
Yes, because at first, when it was taking form, in particular when I really started to develop, because the first real true inspiration of wanting to create something in this thing, because while I enjoyed things when I was younger, I wasn't really wanting necessarily to create something. I just found them enjoyable. But the movie Nightmare Before Christmas was something that really spoke to me in a lot of levels, and I wanted to create something similar. So when I first really delved into it and wanted to make this, it was very, very Tim Burton inspired, which it still is. But as it's gone on, it's gone past sort of kind of almost just being something that could almost just be a rip off in a way of, and now that I've developed more styles, it's very much become its own thing, but with some very obvious inspirations.
So, like, did you see Nightmare when, like, how old you would have been to kind of be like, okay, this is, like, definitely what I'm about?
Probably about 13 or so. That was another case, ironically, when I first saw things for the movie. I was much younger when the movie actually came out, but it was something that scared the hell out of me. But then when I got a little older and kind of remembered that the movie was a thing and that was interesting, and it's like, I need to actually watch this. It became a huge thing to me. So I would say probably about 12 or 13, which is about the time I saw it and when I would have started actually creating the series.
Well, it's funny because, like, with that movie, I've read that, like, it was, like, the definition of a cult hit, where when it came out, it kind of flopped, if anything. Like, it did
Yes.
decent, but it wasn't until way later with, like, both VHS and, like, reruns on TV that, like, now it's, like, one of Disney's big moneymakers, where, like, it's also just the most notable thing, and like, popular. It's the most popular thing Burton's ever done, even if he didn't
I
direct
mean,
it, but, like...
even to the point that it was used under Touchstone, which was Disney's, we'll make this movie, but we want to have plausible deniability that it was actually ours. So it was Touchstone, not Disney. And now Disney's like, yep, that's ours. Yep, we totally made that.
Fun fact with that, Pulp Fiction is also in that same vein of a movie that was a Touchstone film that Disney kind of, like, brought up
Yes.
later on.
Yes.
So, I guess at that age, too, I could imagine that that's around the time you also got into more, like, genuine horror films, and I guess media that's meant to be at a more older age. That stuff that's kind of the middle ground of, like... I guess in terms of that, what were some, like, the first horror films you saw that you kind of feel like were inspirations for High School Death Party?
I think one of the ones that would have inspired it, and I think where I started to take a more turn into being able to learn how to enjoy it, was actually the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And while I can't really say there's much that's put into High School Death Party from that, but it was one of the first series where I kind of understood to deal with my fear of it was to lampoon it, was to make it something kind of funny and joke about it. And the more and more that I kind of did that and found humor in some of the things where, certain effects being kind of cheesy and kind of laughable, it made it more something that I just enjoyed entirely. It wasn't anything that was really anything worth being afraid of. So it's kind of a thing where the origin is of something that, the Nightmare on Elm Street being much more macabre, but as far as that, as well as Tim Burton, his works are always very much a very light-hearted take on something that would be otherwise very dark, and I think I always found that entertaining because it subverts what you would expect out of something. So you can have the Grim Reaper, and oh no, that's going to be that's death, that's the end, or you can have the Grim Reaper and he's just some dude doing a day job. And it just makes it infinitely more entertaining.
Oh, yeah, I mean, like, it's funny you bring that up because, like, with Nightmare, that's kind of the epitome of, like, horror as sort of a comedy thing, where it began as a very serious horror film, but then by the end of it, it became a comedy, basically.
Yeah, very much so.
It very much embraced kind of the goofiness of the character, and it kind of... I guess it's maybe a very crude way to put it, but I guess devolved into, like, by the end of it, of, like, a fucked up Chuck Jones cartoon, basically.
Absolutely. And I think also, too, because the character of Freddy, when I was younger, I didn't particularly like the slasher movies. I thought they were kind of boring. But Freddy was so much more of a stylized, very upfront character that he was much more gripping to me. And I think that's where a lot of my style grew from, like the love of the 80s, just very much being over the top, very much in your face, memorable kind of thing. It's, one of the things that I really grip to is that, as well as some of the very old classic, like vintage black and white ones that are just iconic.
So yeah, like, I would say, like, in terms of, like, High School Death Party, those are the two vibes I get, where it's very much in the 80s, like, horror as, like, sort of dark comedy, where it's very in your face, it's very over the top, it's very silly, it's very gaudy, and then the I mean, I guess it's the whole like German expressionism, like kind of this very distorted, surreal take on horror that begins with stuff like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, and then gets way to Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, all those films. Where I guess in terms of that, like those films are very stylized, where the sets especially are very like big and like cloudy and really kind of like pop in a weird way. That I also get that kind of vibe of, which I guess also kind of goes into the whole Burton thing because it's Burton style
Yeah,
essentially.
the overall look, I would say, like Halloween, experiencing Halloween as a kid, particularly in the 90s, but even then not so much even just the view of what Halloween is like as a kid and how fun it is, the nostalgic memories of the enjoyment of things being fun, but also kind of being scared, and that very garish look. Those are the three main kind of vibes I kind of wanted from High School Death Party.
I mean, yeah, like I think with like what you're saying is like Halloween as a kid, where it's very big, it's very colorful. There's
Mm-hmm.
tons of like merchandise for it. That a lot of it is very odd but very appealing, and that kind of middle ground of like, it's for kids, it's silly, it's cartoony, but there are elements of like the inherent darkness of the horror genre are also at
Mm-hmm.
play.
Mm-hmm, exactly. You can
Like,
go one way or another. You can have the very fun, garish, not scary version, but you can also go right into the more grim horror things, and both are fun in their own respectives.
no, absolutely. That's kind of like for me what sort of sticks out. And I mean, you bring up the '90s in general. Like one of the big things for me with the series is that it feels very indebted to kind of the golden age of like animated series that was the early to mid '90s, namely with stuff like the more comedic stuff, like off the top of my head, like Ren and Stimpy, Animaniacs, Our Monsters you brought up, but also stuff like Freakazoid, a lot
Absolutely.
of that stuff. Kind
Yeah,
of
and
in
that's
that
where I got
era that was the
most of my
golden age.
inspirations.
Yeah, like that era that was kind of the golden age of like absurdist slapstick like humor that would kind of give way to I guess like shit posting essentially.
I
Like
would
I
say
definitely get that vibe.
probably past the ones I mentioned, two that really also carved out my more interest in artistic style would have been Earthworm Jim as well as Invader Zim.
I could see no like with Jonah Vasquez and Doug T, those two are like very apparent in your art. Like
Mm-hmm.
especially with the more like over the top designs where I definitely get that element of like taking that sort of approach of like very strange, very vibrant designs that go well to like looking a lot more surreal and even kind of more like eerie.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would just take it like you would also like I say, I guess like Jonah's earlier stuff with like Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, where it's like way more in your face with the like kind of dark humor that guy's always been about.
Yeah, Zim was my first introduction to Jonan Vasquez. I found out about his other works much later, and
Yeah.
I think for the most part, I took more from the way that Zim looked, but in his darker looks, I did take a bit as to how to convert things if I wanted to make them look a bit more dark or creepy, going out of just the fun creepy into the whole thing that's more unsettling looking.
Oh no, I get it. I'm more just saying as in like how Invader Zim's kind of the starting point of like that was a very popular show, and then I guess as
Sure.
you got older, you learn of his name. Then it's like, oh hey, here are a bunch of
Yes.
comics he made for grown-ups that also have a lot of like those elements, but in much more less restrained elements.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I mean, I would say too, you bring Work from Jim, like in general, like in terms of the absurdism of the series, I think that is a big element of like Jim and also stuff like the Neverhood that's sort of like over the top surrealist comedy in the vein of almost like Monty Python at times, where it's like whatever is the weirdest joke, we'll do it because that's probably the funniest.
Oh, of course. I mean, just the concept of it's a worm in a suit. It's the whole thing of the immediate subversion of something you don't expect, and it immediately makes it funnier that it's something so insane.
No, exactly that. It's just playing into like how wacky something would get. And I mean, like, I guess two other things with that were like the two other kind of styles that I picked up from the comics. One is like honestly a lot of '90s games, especially in the 16-bit era, where like in terms of color and design, I think there are a lot of properties from that era with stuff like Ghouls and Goblins, Splatterhouse, like
Mm-hmm.
Zombies Ate My Neighbors, where it feels like very much what I could imagine we're going for. And then like I can take it like later on, anime kind of came into play, anime and other Japanese like kind of art forms like manga that kind of went to the
Um,
designs of the whole.
yeah, a much later inspiration definitely been from getting into One Piece in particular. I think because of Ichiro Oda's ability to make things both still feel like a very epic like action anime, but still really silly and absurd, and still manages to make those styles work. And it is funny too, you mentioning things like Splatterhouse, Ghouls and Ghosts, Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Funnily enough, those were not games I played when I was younger. Those were games I got into a little bit later in life. They're ones that I really, really enjoy now. And definitely things like Ghouls and Ghosts definitely took an inspiration. Zombies Ate My Neighbors, as far as like the very bright, garish look were things, but those were kind of later inspirations. But that also, too, of course, this has been an idea I've had for a long time, and it's slowly been molded over just life experience and other things that I've gotten into, which has kind of made the amalgam that it is now.
Again, I'm more just saying is like kind of seeing how like you've added things over time, and that these sort of inspirations and styles have kind of like developed it to the state it's in now.
Oh, sure. I find it's one of those cases that it's to think to just be quintessential weren't ones that were kind of on the ground floor. Again, like things like Ghouls and Ghosts. I feel like something would just be, of course, that was an early inspiration. Like, no, actually, that was I was in my 20s when I finally started actually playing those.
I mean, no, valid. I mean, too, like, in general with, like, 90s, again, the 60-bit era where, like, visually, in terms of coloring, like, I always associate that era. You look at a lot of the big titles on, like, the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, they're very vibrant. They're very vibrant,
Absolutely.
very bright, almost, like, garish at times. And I kind of get that element of, like, with the designs where the colors in it very much pop. They're very in your face with the way they're kind of, like, designed.
Yeah, I want the fluctuates in a way of kind of gross, muddy colors to be a world that looks dead, but then the characters themselves are generally very vibrant, or if they have one specific color on them, they may be mostly muted, but that one color will be very vibrant, very bold to make them stand out. And again, it plays off of the whole duality of things like Halloween, where it can be very muddy, dark, and scary, but then also very vibrant, garish, and again, a lot of those things of the 80s and 90s inspired that, I guess, generally because I grew up during the 90s, so.
Oh no, absolutely. Like I do definitely like get that, and that aesthetic to me is very like 90s. And like I mean, too, I would say with the fashion of the series, that's something that always kind of stuck with me. Where like it's very like a big element of it is kind of the designs in terms of like outfits. Outfits are very much a forefront of the character designs and kind of making them stick out.
Yes.
Is it just a case of you? No, go on.
Sure. The fashion, and it was something out both. A lot of it was from the cover arts of Death Note. The Death Note series had a lot of very elaborate fashion, very interesting looking outfits they would have a lot of times in the cover art, as well as based a lot of times on my own fashion sense. In fact, there's quite a couple times where I've pulled from my own wardrobe just to make outfits, and particularly for the main character. And as far as keeping it interesting, it was another case that was born of getting into One Piece, whereas most characters in most series tend to only have one outfit. Something I always found interesting about One Piece was that almost per story arc, there'll be a new outfit, and I found it interesting how characters could still be defined without that. A lot of times in Western media, characters seem to be like purely defined by what they wear. They can't break out of that. They have to look that exact same way. And I thought it was so interesting, at that point in my life, to see characters who could still be so defined, even if they had a radically different outfit. I still know exactly who they are because that personality rang out in them. So that was something that I gravitate to, and I think it breathes more life into characters. And I find it much more interesting. And even past that, just allows me to also not feel like I'm always drawing the same thing over and over. I can play a bit with it. If I start to get bored with one outfit, I can find a reason for them to be in another one. And it just as a whole, I find it very interesting. The whole just gothic fashion and aesthetic is something I've always enjoyed and thought was really cool looking.
Oh no, absolutely. I was just saying that, like in general, I definitely think with One Piece, where it's like the characters don't so much have set designs as they do have like, if anything, styles. As in, like
Yes.
you know what they'll wear, but there's usually a variety where, like with a lot of the stories, they'll do something else, and it's not a focal point as much as just is like, well, it's like real people. You don't just wear one outfit the rest of the month. You wear a variety of them, and you'll sometimes stick to ones than the others. And I mean, in general, too, with, this, of course, being said in high school, it kind of just makes you think of, like, well, that is the age where you're very fascist, conscious. Very conscious of
Exactly.
that, and you're very conscious of what kind of stuff you'll wear and how it will pop. So I think it also plays
Exactly.
into with a lot of the characters, like, their personalities. It would make sense to be very much into, like, very over the top. Not over the top, but very, like, vibrant, in-your-face outfits that stick out compared to, like a lot of it just kind of sticks out as a whole when you look at it.
Sure. And again, it adds more into dressing down more, and other one's more prone to dressing up. And as far as that, there still is certain style kept. It's like, while one character, it's like, okay, this is how his stuff is always going to generally look. I can play around with it, but that's still the vibe of the character, and it still makes them iconic, while in being able to kind of switch things up. The main character of Ridley will always have like black and white stripes on him to some degree, or the character of Pequena keeps in a very general style to her outfits, but they change in sort of a theme or color variation. And it just, again, I think it's something that just makes the characters far more interesting to look at.
Well, no, exactly. Where it's like the general gist of what they'll wear, but there's always something unique to every issue, which I think is a very interesting approach, in that it kind of adds an element of, like, sounds odd, but just like, yeah, you wear a different outfit every day. Like, you're gonna have this where, like, yeah, it's not just gonna be the same. I mean, like, related to kind of the whole thing with high school, where, like, how much of the series would you say the series is more of, like, based on your experiences in high school, where, like, the things you went through and kind of exaggerating it, or is it more just like that's the setting you use for the more over the top stuff, where it's a good backdrop when you want to go really over the top with, like, the jokes and the plots and all that?
It's a little bit of both. The humorous setting, but at the same time, it could be moved anywhere, any place. So long as the characters have been established, we can kind of do whatever we want with them. But as far as a lot of the events that do happen within the high school setting, there are points that were directly lifted from life experience, different people I've known. So it really takes from a lot of different things. It is a situation that I initially wanted to make this comic much earlier in life, but I think it's sort of a blessing in disguise that it took me as long as I did, because I have much more to pull from on many different occasions for just absurd life experiences, and I think the series has benefited from that.
Well, no, exactly. In the element of, like, now that you've really lived through it all, you can say that, like, okay, here are all these events that have happened that I can very much use as good fodder of kind of, well, you said the sort of middle ground of, like, yeah, it's meant to be very over the top. It's meant to be very silly in a lot of the ways, but this should still be relatable in the veins of, like, you went to high school, you went through it. This is, I would say a lot of the characters feel like just kind of cartoon parodies almost of people you've known. Like, they're meant to be kind of
Absolutely.
like, you knew people like this. They probably were nowhere near as over the top as this, but all of them are kind of playing into that, which that kind of gave me the vibe of definitely, like, okay, I could see how, like, they were nowhere like this, but definitely, like, there was that element of, okay, this was based on somebody in some way.
Of course. And one thing I've always strived, I do pull from a lot of life experiences, people I've known. The main character himself, Ridley, in a lot of ways, sort of teetering on the bridge of a self insert, but I never wanted it to be, to a point that it was a garish Mary Sue or anything like that. So I always want to make the characters in a way that, while they pull from some experiences, also have it in a way of everyone has known certain people like this. They're so, you know, hyperbolic, and they're sort of an amalgam of different things, where inevitably, if you've not necessarily known that person, you know someone similar, or if not fully that way, because it's so overblown, it's the way it felt when you were that age. You're looking back, it really wasn't much of anything, but when you were there at that moment as a kid, it seemed like it was the most ridiculous or most dire thing in the world. And so I wanted to play off of my own experiences to build off of a foundation, but I wanted it to be something that you could still relate to, even if you didn't know that. Because one of the worst things ever are just things where you go into a project and you feel like you needed to do reading beforehand, or you had to know these people, else it's not interesting. And I always want to make sure that even while in a lot of cases some characters may share my viewpoints on things. I still want them to be themselves.
Well, I was gonna say, like with Ridley, like he's definitely the case of I definitely get the element of he was very much inspired by how you were in high school and how you were at this time of life, but you still have it as like a parody, not maybe not parody, but an exaggeration of like was how I was, warts and all, and that like I was nowhere near like this, but it almost was like it was not you could caricature it as being that essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. As well, overblowing things to the point that he doesn't prey to like main character-itis. You have so many over-the-top characters, and he himself is a bit more of the toned down character, but he still has elements that are very much overblown, and ways he can overreact. And another way that I always try to do that is making him extremely visibly expressive, so that even if he may not necessarily have been the funniest thing in the moment, speaking wise or joke wise, he has very, very memorable facial expressions and he can be physically funny.
Well, no, yeah, like I was just gonna say that like it's very much the element of like the opposite of a Mary Sue if you're bringing up, where it's like he has flaws. He is still a very sounds funny, but he's still a very human character. And just because he is the main focal point does not mean he's any less over the top as anybody else. And he gets up to a lot of the same scenarios as they do. It's just that he's the one you focus on because he's the most, I guess, like multifaceted, as in like he can have the most realistic reactions to like situations.
Absolutely. And we see many times, maybe just there's no in ever hiding that he isn't also acting very petty and childish, but he's just the one that we're following at the moment.
Well, yeah, it's in the element of like he's a main character in that he is the one we definitely follow, but that does not mean he's going to be the goody two shoes. He's going to be as like flawed as everybody else. It's just that he's the one where the plot focuses on him, and it's not going to take away from anybody else because when they do need their spotlights, they get it.
Exactly. And going back to the original content, I ever tried to keep at a point that is almost always in the moralistic high ground, the very much the character who we rarely see any flaws in him, is all around just a perfect character, is the Grim Reaper himself, just because of the sheer absurdity that Death is the only solidly good person in this entire series.
Well, then too, just kind of playing into like as a character, to me, he feels like almost a parody of like the dad you would see in like a '50s sitcom, like the Leave It to Beaver, like very cheery, very wholesome, very friendly, like type of like old dude who wants to like play ball with
the
you.
Perfect dad who always has the moral high ground and knows, but he just happens to be Death.
Well, then too, I guess kind of playing into like taking the horror aesthetic and like absurdity. I think just in general, the whole idea of like the Grim Reaper being a job no less than like a firefighter, that this is just the job he has, and that there are tons of people all over the world that do it. It's just that he's the one we focus on.
Yes.
And also playing into how like, the series seems very kind of, I guess, English eccentric in terms of being very American, but like, well, it's set in the American like world of death, basically.
Yes. In the continuity of it is a amongst Ridley's family, and they make references that there are several different deaths positioned all over the world, but the primary area we see, and the one that his father takes over, is conveniently the same part of America I live in, because that's the only place I really know and can draw inspiration from. So,
well, yeah, I very much that like I can definitely see that in terms of like, yeah, this is based very much so much on it. I may as well have it as like canonically it's set in the same area, like just to kind of add to the element of like this is meant to be a reflection of like what I went through a lot of the time.
It helps out one of the original concepts of it, because something else, the Mexican Day of the Dead, and I initially was going to make the series much more based around Dia de los Muertos, but the more I did it, it was more the realization of, well, I'm not from Mexico. I have no Mexican heritage. And while I don't necessarily think that it would be rude or disrespectful, it's just more I can't really pull much from this. I may as well pull more from what I know. And then it kind of bled into the idea where I can make the underworld much larger, and it could be, certain areas of it look like different views of the underworld. The one that we see is the general kind of idea of it's all dead and barren, but there could be an area that looks a bit more like, the way that they celebrate Day of the Dead, very colorful and bright, and then there's other ones that may look like the Egyptian view of the dead, or the Norse. And it allows for a lot of ideas to combine together, and then the joke of how do these different beliefs of the dead combine together, and they're somehow all one thing, and it works because why not?
Well, I mean, I feel like with all of that, it reminds me very much, if we're talking Burton, like Beetlejuice, where the whole joke of that film is like turning the concept of dying in the afterlife into like a bureaucracy. It's no different than like going to like the dentist, if anything. It's very much that element of like lots of paperwork, lots of hassle from that, and that the joke is that it's it's Tim Burton as most Tim Burton, but the whole joke is that you're basically in an office a lot of the time. The whole like idea of it is that like this is no different than any other like. You think you died, then it's the end of like taxes and all that, but no, it's the same thing.
Exactly, and it's the concept of purgatory. The whole joke of like being in purgatory, high school and school, it feels like being in purgatory, or again having to do bureaucracy, stuck at the at the DMV or something like that. Yeah, just playing off of these little things that happen to us in life. It may as well all be just living in purgatory.
Yeah, it's kind of playing into like the whole idea of like viewing high school as like, okay, this is just a waiting time. Once I'm out, everything's going to be right on track. It's all going forward. And then playing into like, okay, if it feels like that, you may as well just fully embrace it of like the dead have it the same way and it's presented in the same way. Over the top as it is, it's not like far off, essentially.
Exactly.
And I mean, too, I guess kind of get to it, like in general with the main four characters. Again, it plays very much into how like they're all just cartoon exaggerations of like people we've known, and very much kind of playing into like almost how we saw them and like growing up. I guess with that, like with Ridley, is there anything else you want to kind of like note with him in terms of like his origins or like how you kind of portray him or what you're like look to do with him?
Again, Ridley heavily, particularly myself when I was that age. A lot of the same fashion senses, the ideas, while at the same time just trying to create a character out of those exaggerations. In particularly being one to easily fall in love and with someone I never had a chance with, and putting all of my eggs in one basket, and then things just falling apart, things like that, just playing off of silly misfortunes then, and sort of my luck that can swing in one way or another, those times. And it's just sort of those, again, just playing off of myself at that time, and how I made mountains out of molehills very easily about things, but still the ability to be his own character.
No, yeah, I mean, just in general, like, I think you bring it up where it does very much give the idea of, like, when you're at that age, love is a very easy thing to get, but to actually apply it can be very difficult, and that there are a lot of times where you just see a person, they're everything you want, then you try it out, and it just falls apart, and kind of playing into, like, in general, that age, I think a lot of people are very, very anxious, very conscious, very, like, almost paranoid in a lot of ways about how their life is, and just kind of taking that idea and, like, cranking it to 5.
Oh, yeah.
And just in general, that like it's when you kind of go past a lot of stereotypes of like the people in high school beyond like 80s movies. That's a lot of people are like that. It's not just immediately okay, they're the jock or the pretty girl, the nerd. They're just like this weird outsider to it that like thinks they're as cool as everyone else when they're not really, but still like very active in a lot of those like scenes, if you will.
Yeah, not necessarily an outcast or lead, but just kind of there, and
that's
they don't really have a place to be, and they're not someone who have any friends, but they also want like the most popular person around, which is kind of the way that I was myself.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's kind of what I'm getting at, where it's like a lot of the time you're just kind of there. You're a person as is anybody else, and it's just that like you think because of media it's going to be something different, and because of like the stuff you consume, it seems very much in that vein. But in reality, like no, it's just kind of like you're just in it like anybody else. I mean, I guess one more thing with him before we move on to like some of the other ones, like design wise, like I understand that he was meant to be grim at a point.
Yes, it early on he was going it was a completely different character. He was a very like tiny like version of death, kind of almost the way that Greg the Grim Reaper appears in Conquers Bad Fur Day, only more with like the face always hidden in the cloak. But it was just kind of more, if anything, he was almost sort of a Quentin type character where he was more the angry foil that we kind of focus on. He's a very tiny little guy, but he quickly changed. Though in his original depiction, Ridley was also still very short, much more simplified. But as I started to go on and change him, he took more and more inspiration from characters like Jack Skellington, and I felt that him being more tall and gangly and more like fashion conscientious, almost to a point of vanity, was a more interesting take on him. And it just makes him as a whole more expressive and more of a character outside of just kind of just being the average Joe.
Well, yeah, like in general, that kind of element of like, it's already funny to kind of view the Grim Reaper, which is this very like old, serious concept, as like a person, and then play into like what if he had a son that had like problems with him, and like kind of taking from like this very basic idea of what you could do with that to now where it's a very multifaceted, and like he's very much his own thing. He's definitely in that vein of like a Grim Reaper type, but as if, again, it's like a job. It's no different than any other kind of job.
Yes.
I mean, I guess to kind of keep things going, like I guess we'll also bring up now Droyland, who's kind of one of the other main focals of the main four.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you remember your kind of oranges with him?
Droland has been one he sort of took after like closer friends that I had at the time, like throughout like elementary school, middle school, high school, and kind of a young adult. He always kind of took little elements of very close friends to sort of just make the quintessential like best friend character. But again, someone who would also be himself and be very juxtaposed to Ridley, whereas Ridley can be very high strung and have very strong opinions about things. Droland is very passive, very, dopey, doesn't really care too much about things. And even visually, I wanted him to stand out. Initially, he was a bit more like stumpy and thick, but as I went on, I changed it more where Ridley is very, not so much stiff, but he's very much a sort of character that would almost always have to adhere to a sort of like wire model, whereas Droland is like just a noodle. He's very flexible. He can move in any shape he really wants. There's not a lot of anatomy that he adheres to.
I mean, with his design, like what always stuck out to me is just that he's always kind of like lurching. Like it seems as if he's so tall that he almost has to kind of like bend over to like talk to people and everything. And that, I mean, as a design for a mummy, it's very unique in playing into like almost more of like the cartoon depiction of a mummy as like a living bundle of bandages. Where when you look at his arms and all that, it plays very much into almost as if like there's not much under the wraps, essentially.
Yeah, and there really isn't the way that is that the bandages sort of form a shell around what they vaguely kind of looked like, or whatever they, I guess, want to look like at the moment. But there's not really anything there. They're sort of more a husk, and it was something that I saw done once. I can't remember where, but I thought it was a much more interesting way of depicting a mummy, because while they're very quintessential like monster characters, which is why I wanted to include one, I wanted to figure out a way to make them unique and more interesting looking. And one of the main things too about like having the arms that are no longer attached, they just sort of hover there, and making something that was changed a mummy from just a corpse and bandages to a mummy could almost be a species.
Yeah, like mummy is almost a weird like monster type beyond just what its origins are, which is of course just a form of burial that was used in ancient Egypt. I mean, I just get the feeling this is the design. Like, I feel like with a lot of it, I almost wonder if these designs you just had for like a while, like you would sketch out and just like you've kind of like crystallized into their more complete form.
It really has been. Again, this has been something I've time of the main four. 3 of them have heavily changed from their origins. Some you can still kind of see bits and pieces of, like, Ridley's face shape has pretty much always been the same, with that very, very super stylized way I do his face. And Drolin's, again, always had the same thing where it's just the one big bandage works like a monobrow, and the one that looks like a ponytail in the back. He's always kind of had that. Quentin has really been the only character that's never really changed. But yeah, these have been things that have slowly just been fully made correct over years.
I mean, too, I feel like bringing up with Droylin, like just in general, as you said, where like I think if high school, but just elementary even, it's like I think everyone has known a guy that's like kind of unremarkable, very quiet, very deadpan to like a almost weird point, and you just kind of knew him. Like I've known lots of people like that, where it almost feels like a cartoon parody of like we've all known that one aloof, kind of like quietly goofy guy, and Droylin is just that idea taken to like its most like cartoonish extent of like that type. It almost seems like he's like he's just very like real like tired.
Oh, absolutely. We've all known people, these quiet. As soon as you underestimate them, they'll suddenly do something you weren't ever expecting. And just, I think, again, he's built off of a lot of people I've known, which I think, when I do that, it allows me to flesh the characters out more and make them feel a bit more real outside of just a trope. But there's also a lot of tropes put in that we can all adhere to.
It's kind of that middle ground of like playing into like tropes that kind of emerge from relatability in life, and then also like taking those tropes and kind of spinning them around or doing a unique take on them that you really feel like hasn't been done before.
Absolutely.
Well, no, like to me, that's very much the vibe I get from him. Of like, he's not from a lot of people, and that kind of makes it funnier that you have this like big mummy monster that like again is almost kind of intimidating at times. And then character wise, he's like he's like an 8-year-old, honestly.
Yes, exactly.
Like he is like of them the most harmless, but just in the vein of like he just seems like he does not sleep.
Even though he sleeps all the time.
And more the vein of like he's just like exhausted and he's just constantly tired, even if like at times he could basically like put himself into a coma.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean the even just down to stuff like his name just being like McGurk is just still like really funny to me.
Well, his original name was actually going to be Doldrum. Was a bit on the nose, and it's honestly the only reason his name isn't Doldrum is because I forgot what I was going to name him, and I knew it was something along those lines, and I was like, I think it was Droland, and then I realized that I liked that name better and stuck with it.
I mean, the name Droland, I'm almost wondering if it is meant to be more of a pun on anything where it fits, but more of like that one. I'm more wondering in the vein of like if that was a reference to anything.
No, again, initially it was going to be Doldrum. It fit with him just being, quiet and don't think that. I literally forgot the word and just went with Droland because it just sounded something that fit his general personality, which is funny as the same way that Ridley got named. He had a different name originally, and I forgot it and named him something different. Ridley was initially going to be named Renfield. This was still when he was the Grim Reaper. He was called Renfield, and I blipped and forgot the name at one moment, and then I literally looked over and saw a picture of Metroid and remembered Ridley, and I went with Ridley because of that. But it fits him better as a whole. But that is a reason why there's a couple times where people get Ridley's name and refer to him as Renfield as sort of a reference to that.
Is Renfield with that one? Was that a reference to Dracula? Because there's a character in like Dracula. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That one was an overt horror reference, and I thought it worked, but yeah, I ended up it was a fluke, and it went to Ridley, but also a reference to Ridley Scott. So it all works out.
I mean, it's funny because like Ridley, like as a name, it's one of those names where it's like it has not that much other than Ridley Scott, not too much horror connection, but it just fits.
Mm-hmm.
Like it
exactly.
just has that sound of horror to it, even if it's a name that like comes up as either the guy who directed Alien or a giant purple space dragon from a video game. So
yes.
Yeah, no. I guess continuing, we now must bring up the wonderful bundle of joy himself, Quentin.
Oh, yes, he is.
What are the origins of Quentin, I guess, in terms of one end as a design and then also as a character? Because he is a fascinating little fellow, if there ever was one.
Quentin, was obviously you have to have your quintessential main cast. Wanted something that was just an inexplicable little gremlin creature. A lot of it took from inspiration of the Muppets, even though he's not necessarily this type of character, but I took a lot from Gonzo with the whole joke of no one knows what he is. He's just this thing. And funnily enough, as I referenced before, the game Super Mario Land 2, at the time that I played it, I was, probably, 5 or so. And in the Pumpkin Zone levels, there were little platforms of what I didn't know at the time were Japanese lantern ghosts. I just saw these weird little egg-shaped things that were sticking their tongue out, and I thought it looked really, really funny. So I kind of took that and worked off of it. Of course, now I realize that this is a very well-known Japanese mythos, but it, in its own way, helps to work off of it, because while he looks like something that is known, it's very much established he isn't. He's not a lantern. He's this weird little urn type thing, and it just adds more in the mystery of what he is, and you're never going to know, because he just is this creature that exists to be a little goblin that lives for chaos, and I think his look perfectly defines that.
I mean, I feel like two things with Quentin, where it's one of I definitely get that element of, as a kid, seeing those designs and just thinking they're going to be stone, because it's hey, maybe they're meant to be an urn or a similar sort of tomb or something
they
made
were
of
platforms in the game, so that's why I thought that they were a hard material. So,
and then also I think I brought up before, but I theorized about how because of the fact that he is canonically meant to be Jewish, that it almost makes him a weird golem in a way of golems are Jewish monsters made out of rock and clay, and that's what he is. So he almost becomes a weird middle ground of that, but then still playing into no one knows for sure what his whole thing is.
I'm not telling.
Exactly. It's the classic case of it's way funnier to just be left for open and just bring it up randomly.
And that it's well established that he even doesn't.
And then, two, bringing up the Muppet thing, where, what I always kind of liked about him as a design is that he's that perfect, range of either perfectly functional lip movements or Muppet mouth, where it's just two flaps of, plastic that go up and down.
Oh, yeah. Quentin, more so than anything, even though the whole series runs very much on this, but Quentin especially is what is funniest at the moment is how he's going to function.
I mean, yeah, I think of the main cast, he is, if anything, the most, cartoonishly expressive in that. Because his face is kind of simple in terms of design, that's a good excuse to just, see how weird you can get with expressions and just throw everything at the map.
Absolutely.
I think even down to just, his eye, where I've noticed, I like how with the eye, he very much puts his emotion into how big or small it gets, where, depending on the pupil, that can often just be a sign of, everything.
Yeah, and how, his eyes will sort of bend in a way that they function for. There's just one to draw him. He is easily my favorite. My second favorite character to draw. Colic is actually my most favorite one to draw, but Quentin is probably the one I end up drawing the most whenever I'm bored, because he's just a very fun character to draw, and I don't think there's ever a point he doesn't look funny to some degree.
I mean, I also just get how it's a simple design, but it's very effective at expression. Where it's because you just have the two most obvious parts of the face, which is the mouth and eye, you can just kind of do whatever at a lot of the time.
Absolutely, and again, once you see him, you immediately he's going. There's no question about what he is. A lot of the characters do have that where you can kind of guess them immediately. You could still possibly go, oh, okay, maybe he's, you could be thrown for a loop. But Quentin, no, I want him to be, exactly what he is, because there's no depth to him. He is just an asshole, and that's what he wants to be.
I mean, I was going to say, as a character, my main takeaway with Quentin had always been, this is just an exaggeration of a very specific type of person, which is just the edgelord asshole that's whole personality is that, and just, how awful that is.
He is meant to be the amalgam of every person you've ever known that you've hated, in particularly the asshole you've always hated that for some reason is always around you. For some reason, they've decided you're either their friend, even though it's very clear that they hate you, or if not a situation like that, the say a kid who is, from the parents are a friend of your parents, so they have to keep coming over whenever they come over. That whole thing, the character that you're like, oh God, you shudder when they're coming around, and everyone has known someone like that.
I mean, I was gonna say, like, those two were like ones that like I've always kind of thought of, like a kid you knew in your friend group who you hated but just stuck around like a weird urchin a lot of the time, and then also like a friend, like a family, like either a relative or
Mm-hmm.
a friend of your like mom who like they set up play dates and you hated it every time because it's like, okay, I guess we like video games, but it's like this guy's just a crazy asshole. I don't like being around him.
The kid who would come over and steal your toys, and he's back to do it again.
Yeah, no, exactly. Just that like epitome of like go away, but they just stick around. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think just that too, and just playing into somebody that's just the embodiment of being gross.
Oh yeah, Quentin. He is the one that if he had a car would proudly have the balls hanging from the back of it and think that this is truly the highest point that a human can achieve.
That and also the peeing Calvin sticker, like that. That
Oh,
is
100%.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, what makes him funny is that he's the epitome of like someone that revels so much in being foul. There is no like limit a lot of the time of just his presence is to be gross.
Absolutely.
Like just down to like just I mean, I almost wonder if a bit of it's designed a gag on like just being a living like ashtray or like a spittoon or something of just like something that exists to just put gross stuff into it that's somehow come alive like a fucked up Pinocchio.
It's sort of evolved into that. Initially I just kind of Muppet sort of thing. There was like these two little like pieces. I thought that the two halves kind of bouncing around was really funny, and then as I went further, I started making him smoke. So like, well, what other ways can I make him just outwardly like gross to be around? So not only does he smoke, but because he has no full mouth or jaw, he can just line the entire brim with all these cigarettes that he's always blowing in your face. And it sort of was like a fun coincidence, like, oh, well, he basically can just be his own, urn or his own ashtray. Yeah. But again, I guess in its own way, it kind of turned into like, oh, he could also be an urn, since it's something from, the underworld. Maybe he's, someone cremated. You never know. It could be something like that.
Well, no, exactly. We're like also with the cigarettes of just like someone that smokes way too much and they freaking reek, and the point of like it's not fun to be around them because the stench is just.
Oh yeah, he's the kind of person that they're constantly in debt because no matter how little money they have, they're going to make sure they're buying a carton of cigarettes.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I know you even said there's a specific brand of cigarettes that you hate so much. That's technically what he smokes.
Yeah, his cigarettes are based after the Dijon Black Clove cigarettes because I knew someone who smoked them, and one alone isn't all that bad, but when it's a chain smoker, it's the combination smell of cigarettes, but with like the oppressive smell of like black licorice mixed into it, and it's you smell it coming miles before you see the person, and I wanted something that was something that was the immediate assault on your nose. He assaults all of your senses immediately.
Well, I was gonna say too, he also just gave me vibes of like a kid in middle school who started smoking and got really into it to the point of that became like a bit of their personality. And so like
Yes.
every time you see them, they're just chain smoking and they smell like fucking vile.
Oh yeah, Quentin was very much based on that the people are cool because they can smoke. Teenager just learned to swear, so every other word out of their mouth is something foul because they think they're very cool because of it. It's again the people we've all met, the people we all hate having to deal with, and it especially works to even in an older sense where we've all been in high school. We've also all known the people that are like that even into their 30s, and it's even more pathetic. Especially with there's always sort of the hovering question as to exactly how old Quentin is. I haven't had a chance to show that much yet, but series goes on, I want to show that there's so much question past what he is as to how old he even is, because at the point you think that he might also be about high school age, there's implications that he was like a 40-year-old man, but for some reason is still hanging around high school, which has its own implications of its own.
Well, that was I was gonna say. What makes him funny is that like it's either that he actually is just like 17, but he's just a 17-year-old that like seems like he's 60, or he's 60 and like he died and he never graduated high school, and so his punishment is that he has to go to high school.
Is he stuck there? Exactly. Yeah.
He's just stuck there, and either way, it's really funny, but you never clarify because it's just more of the. You bring up Gonzo, and very much in that element of Gonzo's whole joke is that he's an incredibly strange character that seems made up out of the blue. And Quentin is just that bit taken to like 5.
Oh yeah, it's the even among a cat, he is still the worst of them all, and nothing can explain him, and we don't want to explain him because that would mean spending more time around him.
Well, I would also just say what makes him fun is that he's the great foil, and that while he is awful, he is always getting what he deserves. Like one of the running jokes in the series is just watching him suffer in a variety of means, which are always deserved. And I think to have one character in the main cast that gets that, it's like I say in that Quentin is the one I think is good to have like not a lot of depth to, where it's like his whole point is that he's gross and awful. It's just funny to have him as the character where you're watching him get what he deserves.
Absolutely, and it should always be the case of the joke will always fall on them, even if it's not full punishment to them. The joke is always that he is not cool. The joke is that he thinks he's something impressive, and he absolutely isn't. But yeah, the full-on abuse of Quentin is always something I take pride in. I remember working on the first issue and being very, very anxious to reach the point in which Quentin is thrown out of the window, as that was my favorite point writing, and I was so waiting to write that scene, draw that scene out.
I mean, like, in general, like, another vibe he gives me is, like, the kid who thinks that, like, Eric Cartman or Bender, those type of characters are meant to be likable, and they're not. But he's almost like the part where he's definitely in that vein, but they remember that it's funny to watch him suffer. That the funniest shit with characters like Eric Cartman or Bender is that they're characters who do awful stuff and then immediately they suffer. And if they don't, that's like a rare moment where the joke is that it's awful that they succeeded.
Yes.
Like, definitely that is the vibe I get in terms of, like, him as a character, and what, for as awful as he is, I think he's, like, one of the most fun characters in the series.
Oh, yeah. Early on, Bender was a big inspiration. The character Bender and Cartman, too.
Yeah,
the time I was making it, I was very much watching, Futurama when it first came out, and I think a lot of that also helped with the way that Bender also, being a more kind of, like, stiff character. He's much more less expressive than Gwen, but again, something that can be, really stiff and robotic looking, but then suddenly much more flexible and funny, and figuring out ways to make those expressions work in a more static looking character.
Well, like, yeah, and then also just the whole gag of, like, well, Bender, the joke is that he's a robot. Of course, he doesn't understand what morals are. And then Quentin's like, no one knows what he is, so he probably doesn't even have a concept of moral compass for all we know. He's just a being of, like, foul desire.
He either has no concept or he has a full concept in the fact that he has no moral compass.
That he revels in that, and that whatever part of his brain that could have mustered has been killed in drugs and alcohol that he drowned, like, years ago.
Exactly.
And then, I mean, continuing, so I guess we'll get to my favorite character in the series, which is Pequena. What are kind of her origins that I could ask?
She was a whole, even though she doesn't really fully function as much of a foil or joke, but a lot of her origin was a joke. I think, again, a lot of it being at my own expense, just the, when I was younger, being, chasing after, a love interest that, I never had a chance with. And her overall kind of point of reference is just kind of, just because, you find someone attractive doesn't necessarily mean good person. One of the jokes being is that the joke isn't necessarily that her physical appearance is anything wrong that's fine. It's more that she's just also a jackass. And also the point of her physical appearance also means that, like, you don't really have to be a particular standard of beauty to be thought of as pretty. But again, the problem is that just because you find someone pretty doesn't mean you need to be focusing all your time to try and be around that person.
Well, no, I agree. Where like the gag of it is that I don't know if I would call her straight up like a villain per se, but she's the epitome of like not evil, definitely a giant a-hole.
She's antagonistic to a point, maybe not quite as much as, but it's someone who's not going to take anyone's shit, and more the joke of how much Ridley romanticizes this person who probably doesn't deserve to be that romanticized.
It's just that like it's such like a very like childish idea of like having a romantic relationship with someone who not only doesn't want it but is also just kind of like toxic in a way.
Exactly, and the joke of the character's appearance, it was never really meant to be a case of like, oh, it's wrong to like someone like that. It was always just meant to take you off. It was just something of you don't expect to happen.
No, exactly.
And then as soon as you see it, it works into, okay, well, how is this character be and function, and a lot of it was also built on there was a show called Eek the Cat that I grew up watching, and it was a consistent running gag that he was completely unaware of the fact that his girlfriend Annabelle was just huge, and people would bring it up, and he would never realize, and it was kind of one of the first real inspirations for the character. Now, granted, I kind of flip-flop whether Ridley can tell or does, who knows, but it was just always a funny gag, and it was something I looked into early on in the series.
Well, it's funny because honestly, as a character, he kind of reminds me of Ridley at times. Like
someone trying to do good and paying for it, yeah.
Yeah, and then also it's kind of a funny parallel bring that up where like the whole joke with Eek is that like that does not matter him at the point where it's not so much a fault but more funny of like it does not register. Yeah. And then Ridley's the joke of you have no clue if it's either like okay he's into that kind of stuff or no he has no clue. Just for some reason it never registers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean too like I guess like kind of I mean too like I bring up what I kind of where like she's interesting that like she doesn't really fall into a category of like the nerd girl or the popular one, and that she's just that kind of like stuck up, very like high and mighty person, but also just does not really have a click. Like she doesn't really fall into any of these categories. She just kind of is as is.
Exactly. He represents sort of the young, naive, growing up and thinking things are way worse than they are, thinking you're going to be, doing this kind of thing. Pequena in her own right is almost sort of more parallel of like being older and jaded. It's kind of almost representative of kind of my viewpoints at times, being older, not nearly as sardonic as her, but just those times where you're like, this shit doesn't matter. Like this isn't important anymore. Why do you care? And it works off of just the whole joke of, with, Ridley, who's always been just this undead creature. And then you have characters like Droland or Quentin who've been dead for, God only knows how long it's normal to them. It allowed me, to make her a character who's recently deceased, working off of that, where they are bitter and jaded. What does anything matter anymore? I'm dead now. And because initially, the original idea, they were all just kind of as they were. They were kind of just, they had all been dead for a long while, and the group was just the main four, even from the very initial concept. But as I was working on the first comic, I thought it was going to make a much better idea if I led into the meeting of Pequena, Ridley falling in love with her, and it also, again, make a character who can be sort of a piece almost for the readers, where how do these things function? Because, the more I thought of it, it would make no sense if I had characters like, Droland or Ridley asking how things function if they've been a couple thousand years. But if I have, one who, where she's supposed to have basically like died within whatever year it currently is, then you can have her ask these questions and then have like bits of lore and then interesting things dropped by the characters.
Well, no, like, yeah, like, it's kind of her joke is that she's the one that actually had experience in the world of living enough to, like, have a very recent memory of it. And that a lot of the jokes is that, like, in a way, she's kind of like the newcomer to it who would be the main, but then the joke is that she's just as bizarre as everyone else in the series in that, in a lot of ways, she doesn't care.
Yes.
I mean, too, like, visually, her design always kind of stuck out with, like, in terms of, like, her outfits that, like, I think especially I get the element of, I feel like she's probably very fun to draw in terms of that.
Actually, she is this character. She is one that, in more recent times, I've just finally been able to kind of get her in a way that she's easier and fun to draw. She can be very difficult in making expressive in a lot of ways. And a lot of that is just due to the character's size and which I'm horrible at remaining consistent at. But yeah, she can be very difficult too, and also because she generally isn't a very expressive character. So there's a lot of times where she can be difficult, but and also, I'll admit, a lot of times I go a little overboard and her outfits are almost too elaborate. So for example, I deliberately toned her outfit down much more in the second issue after the first one, because drawing that entire like spider-themed outfit started making me go crazy near the end.
I guess I just mean in the vein of designs. I think it's kind of fun to come up. I see what you mean of like technically,
thinking out like things like different ways to theme like her outfit. I do, but yeah, as far as just consistently drawing her, she is the most difficult to draw of the main four.
That makes sense. And I mean, I feel like to at least will say where like face wise, she is in a lot of ways the kind of I guess Droyland is technically this. And the element I think she's the most like has the most normal responses to what happens, as in she seems the most like adjusted to the human world. But that's still like again, she's as goofy as everybody else. Is that she's the like least silly of the main four at times.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And I mean too, I feel like with the gag of like her being in a lot of ways very like it kind of as like a companion to like Ridley, where Ridley is very like fashion oriented, very kind of like not maybe vain, but very into that kind of like fashion stuff. Like Bikini is like the female equivalent of that kind of plays into like kind of how she views herself, and then also kind of the gag of like being one of the more like in a lot of scenes, she's a lot more of the very weird responses to things and all that.
Yeah. Some people that I've known who have basically turned like spirit Halloween costumes into daily.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that. I mean, just like too, like I mean, I feel like her design especially is the most like I definitely I don't know what the term is beyond macabre, but like it's I guess it's like golf, but not quite in that like there is that element of the aesthetic, but in a more kind of restrained. It's less obvious, I guess, but.
Yeah, I just pulled the things that I think it's more just that it's much more garish. So it's not just all like black. I still allow it to be very vibrant, and again certain each outfit for her is very like themed around like a certain thing. The first issue were spiders, the second one were like ghosts, and I've done other ones that are like jack-o'-lanterns and whatnot.
Yeah, kind of playing into like her like outfits kind of fitting the general aesthetic, but having them be like a different one for every like comic. That's the most like apparent. Because I'll say too, like of the, it sounds funny, but of the main, she is the most humanoid, as in like you can tell that she was once a person compared to the other ones, which are very like silly in design.
All the other ones are very much creature. Yeah, she's really, besides very overt exaggeration, is just a blue person.
Yeah. And I mean, too, I feel like it does, like, you can make the case for, like, with her expressions, it does work in that, like, well, she is a human. She's not going to have, like, the really wacky, bizarre response to everything because she's still, like, grounded in it.
Yes.
And I mean, too, I feel like in general with, like, the main four, I do like how they all have very different body types that kind of play into the joke for, like, to kind of give, like, a comparing, like, Quentin is very much a head, but he's a head that changes, that he can basically bounce all over the walls or just be weirdly stagnant at times.
Yes.
And then Pequena is the most humanoid, but has a very, like, in-your-face, very apparent, like, physique that plays into a lot of, like, gags.
Well, yeah, too. You have the very extreme. You have the super tall one, and then the real tiny one, then the real skinny one, the real fat one. You can see their silhouettes and immediately know who all four of them are.
It's a very weird comparison, but to kind of say what it reminds me a lot of is Robotnik in Adventures of Sonic, where, like, that's another design that's very over the top and, like, big, and that there's a joke of playing into, like, this guy just kind of, like, stomping all over the place, where he's very in control of his body, but that kind of just plays into how, like, he's very in control, and that just means he kind of throws his weight on a lot, like, pun intended, so, like...
Oh, yeah. There was probably a little bit of inspiration in that, and, like, other, like, old cartoon characters would do that, because it's just a humorous thing to work with.
Yeah, no, like, definitely. I mean, like, for me, her best scene is still her chewing out, like Quentin for the first time.
Oh, yeah. Again, it was a great way to fully introduce really almost both characters, because we finally get to see that Quentin is absolutely a paper man. As much as he tries to act like he's big and bad and will say and do anything, all it takes is to really make fun of him and he'll run away crying.
Yeah, well, no, it's kind of playing into, again, like, what Quentin's kind of the archetype of, like, someone whose whole thing is being really, like, loud and edgy and, like, reactionary and very mean, and, like, that's their whole personality. But then the second they get criticized once, they'd have, like, a screaming fit. Like, there's no consistency.
Oh, yeah.
And then, like, Pequena, because of the fact that, like, there's that, like, apathy to so much, just not caring and just being, like, legitimately vicious.
Yeah, and you could, and again, the polar opposite with that you could say anything to her mean nothing.
Yeah, that you could just say literally anything because she's so, like, used to how she is. It, like, does not register as anything.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think, like, of the main four, what makes her my favorite for a lot of reasons, one of them is just that, like, I think because she's the most grounded, you get a lot of the most fun reactions of, like, again, odd, but she's kind of the straight man of the group in that, like, she has the least amount of time she'll like become a screaming cartoon character, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I've the crux of the show, the where really the meat and potatoes, I would say, of the series is when I can finally get all four characters together. Like, I always find the humor of the series is quintessential to exactly how many of the main characters are together. And which is why I really enjoyed the beginning of issue 2, where we really get to see all four of them interact, and there's few little bits, which obviously there'll be more. But having all four of them bouncing off each other is always a thing I really, really love writing.
Absolutely, just the element of, like, having these four very unique, bigger than life personalities, like, having to like interact with each other and, like, get up to, like, shenanigans and all that, where they just, like, constantly, like, bounce off each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's definitely, I could see it, where, like, a lot of the, like, really funny stuff is just, like, having it just sounds odd, but there's basically no straight man, as in there's no one that's meant to be, like, normal. They're all meant to be, like, very absurd, and also just playing into how, like, again, like, actual high school, it's not the movies where it's, like, the jocks, the nerds who are all one archetype. It's, like, a variety of people that are all, like, their own thing, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's too many times where it's the oh, this is based after, like, the nerds and the rejects. I'm like, this one kind of isn't. They're just kind of there.
I mean, no, like, yeah, like, just with the whole, the whole thing of, like, that's not really how people work beyond 80s, like, movies that are meant to be very silly, and that this is more based on, like, how it actually goes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to kind of move on to some of the more main side characters, I mean, just kind of start easy, like, Colic is definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, Colic very much come over and steal your toys. Colic is that one kid who would come over and, like, be picking his nose and then touching everything you own, and then after he leaves, realizes he, like, peed in your toy box.
No,
like,
yeah, exactly.
That's the kind of person you're like, I hate you, but for completely different reasons. And, like, you're not really an asshole, but
It's the whole thing of like he's the gross weird kid who's by all means not a bad person. He is just just weird. Not even insane. He is just weird.
Yeah, he plays off of that as well as like the toxically happy people where you're like, okay, that's great that you're positive, but that's not humanly possible. Just be upset about something at least once.
Well, it's almost like with him, it almost feels like he's like a cartoon character from like a little kid show where he's always
Yeah.
happy and like upbeat
Yeah.
and jolly and like laughing, and he has no depth beyond that. As like that's the joke where it's like he's just always in a good mood. He never gets mad, and it's like, do you even know what that is?
And even as stated, it's like, and that's another reason you hate him, which sounds terrible, but like no, if you're really around him, it's just the whole just have an emotion other than happy.
Yeah, no, it's just the whole thing of it's more just weird of like just have feel anything else. Which I feel like with like the main like when he interacts with the main form, maybe Quentin, it's funny of I think the funny stuff with him is with Quentin where it's like the fascinating like opposite ends of like someone whose whole thing is just being miserable and just like drug addled with like basically a 4-year-old.
Quentin and Colic, again, I have. I see them very much on like a slider. They're on the same one, but just they're on the opposite slider of the like awful, angry, jaded jackass one, and while the other one's the like overly happy, sweet one. And see, they just have to deal with what is essentially themselves, but also the polar opposites.
No, yeah, I mean too. Like I would say, like it's funny that the gross kid is like meant to be a slime monster.
Oh yeah, I always just slimes I always just thought were like funny things, and they're fun to draw because again there's no even with compared to how much I toy around with like Quentin's thing, there's still a bit of a model to adhere to. Colic I can just draw however I want at any moment, and he's just always fun to draw. But
well, I would say
I think
go on.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I think my favorite point involving Colic, though, is probably just the point in which Pequeña screams at him to just basically feel another emotion and happiness, or she'll destroy him.
That one is great in like the moment where Pequeña becomes a screaming like over the top like person, and that it's perfect that her response is to someone that like cannot respond to anything beyond a well shucks, and that he just doesn't care. Like
exactly, like Quentin, being upfront and being and making fun. She can deal with that, but someone who is just always oppressively happy, that's the thing that brings her to the point that she's going to literally murder someone.
And I think too, like playing into her, like I mean, I remember that scene. The two expressions, one of her just looking completely dour, and like her face is covered in shells, like a noir film, and then the one where she just goes full like coyote, like rabbit teeth, like bloody eyes, just like I'm going to murder you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like I don't know if this was, but like the two designs here reminds me a lot of are Blob from Clay Fighter, and also like the Blob guy from Jim. I forget his name, but that guy too. Yeah, Snot.
Colic just kind of more so than anything probably from Clay Fighter, but I don't even know if they were necessarily even in my mind with Jim. Oh, just a slime character would be funny, and they would fit perfectly for that type of character. And it was literally just drew a blob with a big eye and a tiny eye and a little propeller hat, and I was like, and he's perfect.
No,
that is all I need.
I get that completely. I'm more just saying if I had to pinpoint like what he reminds me of in terms of a gross, weird green blob guy. Sure. Those are the two that definitely like kind of come up to me at least in terms of like what his design kind of like comes into. And then again, like just being like the gross kid, like I guess the Ralph Wiggum, but just way more like just gross.
Yeah, it's like Ralph Wiggum mixed with the gross kid from MP Kid.
Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
I said it kind of a cross between Ralph Wiggum and the gross kid from Three of a Wimpy Kid. I forget his name.
Fragley?
Yeah, that character. I was like, basically just kind of combined them.
Yeah, Fragley, I can kind of like less erratic, but in terms of just being like gnarly and just like yeah, like the one of like, why do you do this shower? It's like, yeah, no, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess speaking of like very odd side characters, I also like to bring up Bartleby because he's another big favorite of mine.
Bartleby is a fun kind of happy accident. I've really enjoyed. He has a lot of weird origins. His initial design was actually going to be used. There was a brief while where I threw around the idea of kind of having a narrator character, kind of a Crypt Keeper. Yeah. And that was going to be the design of the character. And it just didn't really work for what I wanted to do. But I liked the way he looked and kind of put him into the background here and there. There's a reference in the first issue where he mentions that he was cut out of the comic. But when it came to issue 2, and this was a plot I'd had very, very long time too. It's one of the older ones that I really wanted to go back to. But the character that Ridley ended up with was a bit too esoteric. He was a bit too grounded in inside joke to really work. So I tried to work things around. Well, how is he going to be different? And I kind of came up with kind of more something that we would all could kind of relate to, especially in more modern era. And I didn't really know how to make him look, and I just kind of I have that design for that character. I may as well use him, and I kind of augmented him a little bit. So even though Ridley is kind of a bit self-insert character in terms of applying to myself stuff, there are little bits of Bartleby that are deliberately made to look and mirror how I depict myself, because he's making fun of self-insert characters or people who would do such things. So even though he isn't a self-insert, I played off of a little bit of that in his design.
I mean, it's kind of funny looking at him as design, where at the start, I can definitely describe it as a mix of, generally Beetlejuice's look, especially with the red and the black and white striped suit. And then also Dr. Frankenfurter from Rocky Horror, and similar sort of very over the top kind of clown and similar jester themed horror characters. And then kind of going into now where I think he's meant to be kind of a Creature of the Black Lagoon, he's the fish man of the group.
Yeah, he was kind of one of those characters. I never had an idea of what I drew him, the more he settled kind of into amphibian, where I'm fine with this. It just kind of was, I drew him at one point and I put webs in his hand. I'm like, this works. So yeah, it isn't anything really official, but he may as well be some kind of Gilman thing.
Well, I feel with
probably,
his
probably a case of he died via drowning, so he's now a man or something.
Well, I was gonna say, I feel that to me comes up where the kind of his the top of his coat looks like fins. To me, it kind of looks almost like the fins of a weird fish.
I could see that too. I always saw them as like feathers on his jacket. See how they could translate, and again, the way his hair fin is flopped down, and again, he's got the webbed fingers, and he's kind of got fish lips and stuff. It's again, the more I worked on him, the more he just became more fish-like. And I think it just worked for the type of character where you just kind of think of someone who's gross and clammy and damp, and just those creepy neck breathers would just kind of look fishy or frog-like, and it slowly just took more and more form.
Well, yeah, no, that's kind of what I was getting at at the whole joke of a weird basement dwelling. They definitely clean themselves, but they do it in a means where they just end up with the consistency of a frog. That's definitely of what I get the vibe of in terms of that, he is the epitome of the a basement dwelling, weird form dwelling freak, to put it bluntly, that just exists, and it just makes everything very uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, I wanted him character, even though there's some very real life inspiration that created Bartleby. I wanted him just to be the quintessential that guy, just the guy you're oh, it's that guy, because nobody wants to be around that guy.
Yeah, exactly. The epitome of you are the reasoning why HR exists.
Oh yeah,
you're not only an asshole, you're just gross.
And even to a point where Quentin would be preferable, because at least you can understand that he. At least with Quentin, you can just sort of almost tune him out at a point. But with Bartleby, it's so annoying on so many multiple levels.
Well, yeah, because it's the element of like it's not like a defense, but like Quentin is the epitome of someone who rebels and that he's like awful. Bartleby thinks he's like not. He thinks he actually is like a Casanova, and it just makes it funnier that it's like, oh, you think this, and you're just like an incel freak.
Yes.
Like I think that's what makes him as funny as it is, where he really is just like, if anything, he's one of the more just believable. They're just people online that like unironically think like this, and this is just how they are.
Oh yeah, again, he's one of those characters that you're like, I took some as easy as it is to see, people like that on the internet. We all have seen or known someone that acts like that.
No, exactly. Just that element of just complete disillusion with like just delusion with how things are, and just like to give an example, would unironically like try to make a Tulpa girlfriend that they learned on like 4chan or something.
Oh yeah, yeah.
No, and I mean like I think he even brought it up with me where like his whole like love gloves thing was based on something that was proposed to you once, if I could ask.
Yes. Again, there are some. I think, ironically, the one who takes the most real world inspiration from my life is actually Bartleby, and that being that the love gloves was not something I fabricated, but was someone I knew legitimately wanted to and had blueprints for the invention of love gloves, and they functioned exactly the way that I explained in the comic, with basically via an elaborate network of radioactive hot plates. They would somehow reconfigure a person's mind, and it was one of those things that when explained to me, I had to sit there and nod and just hold on to every facet, because I was like, this can be used for something hilarious.
I mean, I frankly give you the credit for not bursting into screaming monkey laughter the way I would have if someone even spent 5 seconds explaining this to me, because it's like, I think what scares me is that probably there are people out there that would buy it at this point, with the way self-help is on the internet. I mean, oh my god.
Absolutely. I think the thing that kept was probably vague, because it was if you can think of this, you might hurt me. So I think I was simply stunned into submission and just hoping he would stop before he decided to like practice his love gloves on me.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. It's more just, again, like, I definitely get that element of with both like high school and outside of it, they are just people that just, because they just do not like go they do not go outside enough, and they spend way too much time online in weird circles. They just get into this shit, and this is just how they think, and it's very, very strange. I mean, also to say, as like another element, like from what we talked about, I do know that he's meant to be also kind of a, I guess, anti-stand-up to a variety of locales you're interested in, which is always great.
Oh yeah, there's a couple references to some well-known lolcows out there, because he's based on that archetype, so it was hard not.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just ask, are there any in particular that you look at and go like, okay, you are basically as close as we'll ever get to a real life like Bartleby, or is it just like a variety that all play into it when it shows up, but then it's just like, it's just quite the reference?
I think a variety has to play into it. I don't think there's any one that I've ever seen that's like fully Bartleby, but definitely, a bit of Chris Chan, a bit of King Cobra JFS, a little bit of Boogie 2988 put there, just because it fits the overall appeal. But for the most part, he is probably the most based on some actual people I've known, who, if they got onto the internet and absolutely would have been cows.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to just say, in the element of like a mix of awful, insane people on the internet that made themselves into laughing stocks with like also just very weird people online and offline that you just meet up with because you have similar interests. And then it's like, oh bother, oh dear.
Oh yeah, I think where there's a lot of inspiration taken from high school days put into that. Bartleby is sort of the of not as much taking from high school days, but people you've known out of high school, well into your adult years, and they peaked in high school, and you're like, okay, this was excusable if you were in high school, almost 30.
Yeah, it's the whole of like, okay, if you were 16, this is how you fought, like fine, it happened. You're like 30 and you still do not have a job. What is happening?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, kind of continuing with this, I guess like talking about high school, like connecting, like Pandora is another example of like they're an exaggeration, but they're not far off from like actual like teachers you knew growing up.
And she is. There's a few direct references.
I mean,
In
I know you've.
particular, oh, and just saying, in particular, the moment in which she explained that she was holding pants aloft like a war trophy was a direct reference to a teacher that I had once.
Well, I was gonna say, like, the thing is with Pandora as a character is that she feels like the cartoon exaggeration of a mix of not a mix, but a certain type of teacher that you knew, like going back to like we all knew, like going back to elementary, where it's like they were either the sweetest, most pleasant, friendly, gentle, like lovable, like person you'll ever meet, just the most like well mannered, like nice lady who can then turn on the fucking blue into a screaming nightmare vulture
Oh
that
yeah,
wants to make your life a living nightmare and is on the verge of like a bipolar meltdown, and how this type of person would flip coins constantly. So it'd be a weird lottery of you have no clue what shenanigans are going to ensue. That's her vibe, just taken to
absolutely,
like 60.
absolutely. I mean, I always thought that like the I always thought the Gromble was really funny in all monsters, and it wasn't until I ended up having this one teacher that I was like, oh, I have met one, and yeah, there's some inspiration from actual teachers in there.
I mean, yeah, just in general, just taking that like idea you get in high school and just kind of building it into something more where it's definitely an exaggeration. But this is in general, there's just a lot of people that are just like manic in that element of they just flip constantly and they're like they have high highs and low lows basically.
Oh yeah.
I mean, too, if like I could just say, I feel like when it comes to like all of them fitting into an archetype, I kind of wonder if she's meant to be like the slasher type in terms of like
She huge plans. She kind of slowly became something as I worked on it, and she definitely could be the slasher archetype. But yeah, when I first made her, she was just kind of just generic dead character or ghost. The more I worked on her, the more I settled into her actually being like a possessed doll.
oh
She kind of
really?
took Yes, the more she took on features that were like doll-like, I kind of settled in, and it was a like doing a more like creepy, exaggerated thing, and I drew like cracks on her, and I was like, I kind of like this. So yeah, she officially is supposed to be like a porcelain doll, like
It,
like one of those porcelain dolls where the like legs, arms, and head are porcelain, but the body is like stuffed. That's what she's supposed to be.
it's funny because looking at it now, that makes complete sense. As in, like having this like clear, like just complete snow white skin, and then very big eyes and mouth that are almost
Mm-hmm.
uncannily like expressive. Because I
Mm-hmm.
admit, like for me, my thought was that like she's meant to be the archetype of both the like slasher from the '80s of like killer with a like big body count, and then also like kind of a play into like the serial killer that has a completely like normal like job outside
Oh
of
yeah.
it. That's the whole like
Um,
yeah.
and in personality trope wise, yeah, I mean she would be that. But as far as what like species, I guess I could say she is. Yeah, she kind of slowly settled more into a doll as I started, really stylizing and figuring out how to draw her in between issue 1 to issue 2. It's also like her eyes are done in a way that they look more like drawn and painted. Like I'll draw like the like lines on them as opposed to just being like shading or something like that. Like those are all very deliberate. She looks like she has like painted features, and like the spots on her cheeks are like put on. It's not like just like painted or something like that. So it's her whole thing is she's supposed to basically be like that, which also factors into parts I want to have backstory is that A, her being a doll, and B, having a sunflower theme on her. Like if you pay attention at every outfit, she has something sunflower related. I wanted to have it that for her, when she was alive, she would she had a sunflower garden where she would bury the bodies of her victims, and she would make dolls that looked like them. So as she died after that, when she came,
I see. I mean, like, to me, like, the vibe of her playing into that would kind of be like a old porcelain doll that like you would find at like an old person's house that's not meant to be creepy, but just looking at it is inherently unsettling. It's just like, I don't like that.
exactly. And those are always things that when I was younger, kind of same thing where it's like it makes me feel uncomfortable. Something that I felt when I was younger about those. And again, it's why it works so well. It's like there's nothing inherently really creepy, but you already have your hackles up, and then you get to see who she really is, and you immediately understand why. But yeah, that's kind of where her design and her lore kind of developed slowly on, where that's why she's a doll and has like a sunflower theme.
That makes complete sense, and it just also playing into how like the most seemingly, I guess Colic would fit in, but Colic's whole thing is that he's just goofy because he just does not really have a brain. Of the most seemingly like sweet and pleasant person, also just being a goblin.
Yes.
And that's like kind of
you
what
can
I would
trust
get.
no one.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like they're the one that like goes into just pure like. Again, I don't know if this is intended, but like a slasher almost, what I kind of always thought was like kind of her like gag.
I don't know if it was. It probably was a subconscious thing. And again, you always have the fear of you never know what will cause her to be that way. Like she could manage to be, the nice version of her a whole way through and never crack, but then suddenly next time something will immediately make her snap. So there's always the knife's edge. You have to walk along with her.
No, like absolutely. That's one that I did like pick up on myself. It's just more well, that's the whole place in the whole joke of like, okay, if it fits the scene, having her be completely normal and almost like kind of down to earth is funny, as in like, okay, like this is meant to be more like casual. And then it's like, okay, this to make this funny, let's just have her go full hobgoblin mode, basically.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also too that the nice side of her is not a facade. That is a real, just as much as the insane evil side. So you never know when she's gonna snap.
Yeah, it's less of the gag of she presents herself as being nice and she just is evil. It's more of like she's genuinely just unwell and that there is no like consistency. They are both her and both not her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, like I think that as a gag is very interesting. I mean, like honestly, looking at it now, like I admit I never really picked. I did also pick up on the whole like her like general outfit is meant to be like prison getup. Like
Yes. She's always conveniently wearing orange or has like a cuff on her.
Yeah, like orange or like the prison jumpsuit that you would like see in movies, and then like that kind of played into what I thought, where she was kind of meant to be the like '80s slasher type. But like seeing the doll now, like that makes a lot of sense. That makes more of anything.
Yeah, as far as a trope though, yeah, it would she fits.
No, yeah, like absolutely. And I mean, I guess kind of continuing like with the Reaper himself, like as a character beyond your state as Renfield, like what kind of came of him?
Again, he was just one of those things. The Grim Reaper has always probably been my favorite monster. I don't know if it's just because it's very just you can't really beat death. It's just kind of very final, but I just always thought the very cliche look was cool and very fun. And with the Grim Reaper going forward, where he wasn't the main character anymore, and made to the main character's dad. Again, it was just sort of the whole joke. What if the only really well-adjusted character here, who's again very much like the old like '50s trope of the dad who always knows what to do, was death incarnate, and the joke of unfortunately in a comic you can't hear it, but my idea is that at all times he always has this deep literal evil sounding voice, but he's saying, very like uplifting and like, well-meaning things. He just all times looks and sounds terrifying.
I mean, I was gonna say, like, as a design, what kind of sticks with me were like, as a kid, there were a lot of Grim Reaper designs I noticed where it's less of them as a skeleton wearing a like cloak as it is the cloak itself as alive. Like the cloak is the being, and it's almost if you take away the cloak, it's kind of the mummy. There's nothing inside. It's a living cloak, and I feel like at times,
that's always been what I strive. That's kind of the look I prefer. Like the skeleton in the robe's always cool, but like I like more that because it's more indescribable. It more plays off of the unknown, and it's a skeleton robe. It's like, okay, yep, skeleton. But when it's just a robe, you're more like, oh, that's death. That's just this
the being.
Entity. It's more an entity, and a lot of the inspiration for how the Grim Reaper looks in this, not only just kind of me going, if I had my way of making like my ideal look of would be this, but a lot of it also came, funnily enough, from the Muppets. It was actually how the way that the ghosts of Christmas Yet to Be in Muppet Christmas Carol looked, because they did a way where like the robe almost looks like flesh.
Yeah, it looks weirdly like skinny, like skin. Like, I mean, like skin.
Yeah,
like it looks like,
and the robe just goes into separation, and that's where I took a lot from it. It to look like it's almost his flesh. Like technically, yes, you didn't see him without his robe, he would also be a skeleton likely. But as the Grim Reaper, the robe itself is almost like this, entity. I took from that as well as the concept of Spawn and how his outfit functions, where it's basically alive. Kind of the inspirations of how his design and in his costume looked.
Well, like, I feel like you bring up the whole thing of the skeleton, but like, I guess it has not been shown yet, but I can definitely imagine in the future where we do see it, I could see as like the joke as in like he looks like what you would imagine a like 50s Leave It to Beaver type dad would be if they were a just very tall skeleton man.
Probably, yeah. It'd probably be just that.
Sorry?
I said, yeah, it would essentially be something like just older Ridley.
Yeah, exactly. Where like, I mean, seeing the design, it almost gives you the idea. Like when he's revealed, it's like I almost wonder if you were to like if he were to take off the top of his robe, it would just be nothing. Like his face is the robe itself.
Probably while he's wearing it, yes.
Yeah, essentially, like as a gag. But I just see we're coming from more of if he had an actual like if more time later on when we do show more of him, then you can see him like out of the outfit.
Yeah, it would like. I don't know if I'll ever actually show him officially like that, but it would probably be something akin to that.
Well, it's just the whole of like if it fits the story or the joke, then you can kind of play into it. But like, I mean, too, I also think as a design, the fact that he's always like towering over everybody, where he's just like canonically 10 feet tall, as to like something to just be purely intimidating and menacing. And then the whole joke is that like he is the only member of the entire cast who is unironically a sweetheart, who just genuinely means all his faults.
Yeah, officially the Grim Reaper's height in the series character in room. So
yeah,
his height is always fluctuating so long as he's like, say normally he may only be like a bit taller than like Ridley, but if like Drolin's in the room, he's suddenly taller than Droll. Like he is just always towering over someone.
Well, then that kind of plays into just the visual gag of like how if the fact that he's way bigger adds into the joke of just everything seems like almost like from a kid's perspective, where like they seem like they would be huge even if he's just canonically like 6'5" or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a weird comparison, but I was talking about a friend with like the show Ike and the Cockroaches, where if you ever notice the backgrounds of the shows are massive. Like it's made like it's like beyond Tom and Jerry, where the backgrounds are like these labyrinth monoliths where everything's 50 feet tall, and it kind of just plays into the whole joke of what like a cat would see everything as, and then like it's kind of feels like a companion to that in the vein of like how just it's almost as how you see it like as a kid, where they'd be 10 feet when they're just like a more like normal height.
Yeah.
And I mean, just to kind of playing into like just their dynamic of like having him be almost composed compared to Ridley, who's way more over the top. I think is kind of fun. It's just like their dynamic. because he is just like, and again, I bring it up again, where like his job is no different than being like a firefighter or a doctor or something. It's very much in that same vein of like, it's a job anyone
It's a
can
rough
do.
job, but you got to do it.
Exactly, like, and it's a job anybody can do. He does it, and it has all the problems that any other job has, and it plays into like the joke of like it as a bureaucracy essentially.
Mm-hmm.
No, definitely, that's one that I kind of picked up in like reading it of like him as a character, where it's like the bit is, what if this like type of being was grounded in that essentially? Like, what if he actually had to be based in that?
That's another one too. I really want to at some point explore like the rest of the Mortis family and like all the different versions of death from all over the world and how like they look and just the different different versions of them. It's something I look forward to doing whenever I can get around to it.
Well, yeah, like that's kind of the whole thing of like, what if like this being was a job all over the world, where like funny compare, it's almost like regional like crusties, where it's like everywhere has their own version of it's designed to like appeal to like that area, and they're all meant to reflect that culture. I could definitely see in the future having like a issue where the whole premise is like just meeting Ridley's extended family.
Yeah.
And they're all like in that same vein, but just meant to reflect like every culture's idea of death, because like all over the world, everyone has even in the same like country, everyone has a completely different take on like what where you go when you die is beyond like religion and all that.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I think that's what makes him interesting, just like as a character and how he's set up in that like regard, and how he's kind of evolved from like he was meant to be the main focal point and then broke off to become like his own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm?
If there was like a joke I wanted to have, should there be like an episode where there's like a family reunion and the Grim Reaper telling Ridley that he doesn't want him laughing at his uncle Anubis's ugly jackal face.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
I don't want you laughing at his jackal face. He's not well.
Yeah, no, that's what I was kind of bringing up, but just like how like every culture's equivalent of their like Grim Reaper just being a job in that area, and how I mean in general too, like if I can ask, like what's kind of your approach to like writing it as a whole? Like for every issue, what's sort of the general approach of like the idea you get and how it's like executed?
I guess it's just what kind of interesting thing could I put these four characters in, and how they're going to go about it. So far I've stuck pretty much to the high school as a setting, but I do want to have start reaching out from it and just what and kind of also go into more like over the top stories. Not just something that could be conceivable, like falling in your first like crush, or doing a project with someone who's annoying. Just whatever I could do. Once you really I've established all the characters and some of the more secondary ones. Just now that they're who they are and we know, just going off the rails with them, and that's just kind of my thing. Just letting it flow, kind of having a simple premise for an episode, but the main brunt of it is just the interactions of the characters.
Well, no, yeah, exactly. Where like it feels like the way it's developing is like it's going to start off with what you said, where it's like exaggerations of high school experiences to where it's more of just like a general absurdist. Like this is a world that is set in like a cartoon depiction of the land of the dead. How goofy can it get? Like how like
exactly
weird.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like even with the like comics as of now, where like that's still where it's like okay, this is definitely like that setting, but you take any chance to go like, okay, then what if this happened, or like what if this happened to like this character? Like you're still using that as grounds to like go full on like over the top.
Exactly.
Like that's kind of what like stuck with me in just terms of like how you write it, where it's like even beyond that, it's not just that with like a Halloween aesthetic, it's that, but with like it's that taken to its like most over the top point where it really plays into slapstick and like kind of weird dark humor and everything.
Yeah.
And I feel like just the way you've like written it, it feels like it is definitely like it takes a lot from what you've established of like 90s cartoons, 80s horror, like just in general, like Halloween as a kid, but it's taking that in a very unique thing where it's like there are like I can definitely pick up on your inspiration in your art as a whole with like as you said, it's your Oda and Tim Burton and Johnny Vasquez, but you're not just doing that. It's that in your own take that's also merging in a bunch of other guys into it. Like I like with Oda, I was gonna say it kind of hits that middle ground of like these are designs that are very like in a way almost kind of grounded and can be very dramatic. They could do very like they could fit perfectly in a serious scene, but they're also still very goofy and they're generally designed to be like rubber hose almost. Like they're gonna like get up to slapstick and very silly stuff.
Yes.
So in that like in that regard, like that's kind of what stuck with me in terms of how you've like written it, where it feels like it's not just grounded to just it's still based in like high school, but it's not just that's not just the end all be all of it. You're not against to go fully silly.
Yeah, I don't want it to be restricted to that and like a high school story. It's like, well, that's kind of its main setting. That's a place where we can have them congregate. Also, as we know, we can go off on weird tangents because this world could allow for anything, and so.
Oh, absolutely. Like I was going to say, like to me, what it kind of gives me the vibe of is, I almost would say in the vein of how like okay, like Simpsons, like the main place Homer works is the power plant, but it's not just the power plant. That's just one of the settings, and then there's a bunch of
exactly.
It's about Springfield as a whole. In the same vein of it's about the entirety as a whole. It's just that if they needed ground, where like okay, where are we going to meet Homer or Bart? You know, Homer's going to be at the power plant, Bart's going to be at the school. And that the whole like thing is that then this like okay then this happens and they break off. So I mean of course I do understand that this is in it's like it's this is the beginning of course. I'm more just saying if I get where you're coming from as in like later on you're gonna break it off
Sure.
that.
Absolutely.
No, yeah, like that is that's like definitely too and like just I mean I feel like just writing it, like what is your general approach of like is it just a case of the idea hits you and you write it there or like do you kind of like build off of other things?
For me, writing process kind of goes down to and I'll kind of write out a rough outline of what's going on, what they're going to be doing, and what they're going to be saying. And then when I draw it all out, I'll probably go over the lines multiple times until they fit that character better. I think one of the ones I do that the most with is actually Pandora, where like I'll write out the general idea and then I'll probably change the line about 5 times until it's accurately like syrupy sweet enough. Or like Quentin, same way, like I'll go back over a few times, like, okay, maybe add some more expletives, add some more like absurd ways of saying things, and it just kind of it's that kind of going over it a few times until it fully feels where each character is speaking in a way that is them, and it's not just all sounding the same.
Well, exactly in the vein of how like they still again this feels weird saying because it feels natural. Like they're not just going to go silly for the sake of it being funny. That's an element. It's more of just because they have such a set character, then it's fun to mess with the continuity, which is more of just their designs or their mannerisms, where it's like it's just as funny for them to respond exactly the way you'd expect them to, as it is to just them go full like just complete break off and just do something else. Like I would say too, like for example, Quentin, where it's like the fact that the joke of the matter is that he swears a lot. It's not just as oh haha he swears. The joke is because he's this like stuck perpetually in a 14-year-old edgelord. The joke is that he just adds unnecessary swearing constantly because he just thinks is how people talk, and everyone points out that it's weird.
Yeah, it's exactly.
Yeah, no, like I
He's
feel like
cool talking that way.
Yeah, because
and also too in that knowing when it's funnier to have him not swear and have him say something completely just ridiculous as opposed to just having say swears is you have to kind of know when it's funnier to do certain things.
No, exactly. Where it's just the whole thing of like the joke is not just that. Then it'll also be like sometimes he just says something completely normally. Sometimes he swears, but in a way that's like how you would generally swear in public. Sometimes he just brings up the weirdest language and words that just has never been uttered in 50 years. Like it's just the vocabularies of everybody where they have a variety of ways to respond to something, and you bring it out when it's at its funniest. Like you bring, I think we talked before, but like with the humor, like if you can bring it up here, it's like kind of how like a lot of the humor is built on what is the funniest right now that would fit these characters.
Yeah, fighting and how they react. I do try to stick with that and not have them deviate too hard. as far as what is funniest at the moment, is less the writing and more things like the physics and the lore of the world. Like, Quentin physically will probably he really shouldn't be able to bend and everything like that. But if it's funnier for him to do that at the moment, he will. But I wouldn't have him say suddenly act completely out of character just because it was funny, unless it segued into something to make a point.
I think what I mean is to kind of refine where I agree with what you're saying. I'm more just saying as in it's the joke with him is not just going to be that he will swear. It's that he has a number of jokes and you'll bring them out one thing. Like design wise, I definitely see that whole thing of like Bikini is a good example where I've noticed with her as a design, the joke is either she's light as a feather or she's canonically weighs like a rhinoceros or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Whenever it's funnier.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, exactly. Whenever that kind of thing, whenever that's funnier is when that will function. And Quentin, in a lot of ways, kind of has the angry video game nerd thing where the joke isn't so much that he's swearing. The joke is that he's swearing over something so stupid, or he thinks he sounds cool by doing this.
Well, exactly. One of the things that came on to me as him as a character is he's almost the original intention of the angry video game nerd character made by XanderDwulfe, where he's the butt of the joke, where the entire joke is that you have this man-child whose entire thing is just getting red-faced screaming monkey anger at random old video games no one but except him remembers, and that it kind of got mutated to people thinking it's funny because it's cool, where it's the joke is that he's always been the ass. He's always been an ass.
Yeah.
And that he is somehow the most in a world that gave us such things as the fucking evil Bugs Bunny and the shit pickle. He's somehow at times the most well composed person in the scene. I don't know if it's intended, but I definitely get a bit of an AVGN. As the character, I definitely get that vibe with Quentin at times.
Definitely in the elaborate ways of swearing. There was a little bit of AVGN in there.
Oh yeah, these very extravagant, layered ways of saying swears that are either completely stupid or weirdly clever. Yeah, no, that's one I definitely do get just in the way he talks, where it's he's weirdly puts the little brain power he has into these very complex ways to insult somebody.
Yes.
And that they're still somehow always very pathetic, and that this is cartoon villain shit. He just says because he thinks it's cool.
And Quentin's also a character I love having periodic moments of absolute poignancy out of him, where there's implication that there might be more depth to him, but he chooses to be this awful.
Yeah, there is a legitimate, the whole joke of, for all we know, there's an actual depth to him that is there, but, if there is one character of the main four who does not deserve it, it's him, so we're not going to give him
Exactly. That's one of those cases you're if that's fun to do a joke, I think one of my favorite things with Quentin is, having him quote things like Charles Dickens or, Shakespeare.
Oh, I agree, because, it's just the whole thing of, it weirdly makes sense he would understand fine art, but just chooses not to because he's too dedicated to just being a just gross, pervert.
He kind of had a vibe to the show Dan Versus, where there was a episode where the character is angry at Mount Rushmore, and they bring up that he has a very weird, periodic, knowledge of things, and they bring up who made Mount Rushmore, and he rattles off exactly who did it. All right, no, where is it? He's I don't know, Quebec. Just stop bothering me. It's that kind of thing. Quentin could be a complete idiot, but will suddenly have this wonderful in-depth knowledge of classic literature.
I mean, the example I would bring up, another character, but Colic, Colic presenting a probably plausible way to deal with this actual world problem that gets immediately destroyed. His response is, okay, what's yours idea?
Yeah, it doesn't even phase. Well, there he goes.
Well, then too, just as a joke, the fact that with Colic, it's the same thing where for all we know, he's a genuine genius, but he's also still really stupid. Just on some random angles, he can be very smart, but at the same time, he's the epitome of just his brain is fueled on Teletubbies.
I think Colic is a case where it's the ever so it'll hit the corner and all of the like neurons spark enough to make something intelligent, and then it bounces back off again. So that was like over like a century of when his brain would spark, he'd write down a bit more.
Exactly. It's like the most like it's the dumbest version of a brain blast one could muster.
Yes.
I mean, just like I mean, too, just in general, with like one of the things about the comic that kind of stuck with me is that it feels very grounded in that like there is a set cast of like side characters. I've noticed where like I know that because it's so early, we haven't seen all of them, but in the same vein of high school, where it's a mix of people that like you'll never know their name or what they're about, but you recognize their face just like that. And then also like people you'll just see once and then forget about a week later and then never see again.
Oh yeah, and I always enjoyed Simpsons like that, who main the secondary tertiary cast could be very large, and you could have like full episodes about them. And I always found those a lot of fun to do. And again, with high school, it fits because again, it's like you would have a group of friends and maybe some guys you kind of knew be in and out of it, and you know some people's names and you're in class with them, but you know you didn't really do anything with them, so you can really flesh that out and then just do just random stories of these characters that we may never even see again, but it didn't really fit any of our main characters, so I'll do it with this guy.
No, exactly what I'm saying. Where it's like these are characters that are layered enough that you could actually do an entire story about them just on their own. But it's fitting of either they're great as like they'll show up for this bit, they'll show up just for a joke, they'll show up for the plot, they'll be the B plot, or yeah, they could even be a main when need be. And like I do know that like on like a lot of the sites you'll have like the side characters like they're fully like realized characters. They're fully written out. It's just a case of course, because it's so early, I can see it as just we're gonna kind of wait and see essentially.
Yeah, there's definitely some other secondary characters I've planned series.
Well, like yeah, I mean, I would say like with Bartleby, I feel like that's definitely an example where in the first, I understand that there was a little more to it, but like first issue he shows up for a joke, then in the next one he is he's the main, he's the I guess villain of the week almost. Maybe not so much that, but in that vein of like a weird bad, like the big bad kind of that the plot is centered against him essentially.
Oh, yeah, he's the controversy of the plot, and it's kind of like well, I need to take responsibility for it. I created him, so he will definitely appear again because initially it was kind of an idea for only really one episode, but now I'm like, I really like him. I can appear again because there's more use I could get out of him in other episodes. So
it's funny you bring up too with like The Simpsons, where it's like, well, The Simpsons, there are so many characters that origins were a random one gag they would have used. Then they all thought it was really funny, and then they just kept using until it became a main. Like the example says, like Hans Moleman, he was just meant to be a random just character for a scene, and then because of the fact that simply Matt Groening hated him so much, they decided, okay, we're gonna keep using him until he becomes one of our favorite side characters who shows up whenever we need him. It's in that same vein.
Oh yeah. Some of the best characters. I said some of the best characters have come from that.
Yeah, exactly. And like I feel like with the side characters that are definitely there, especially like in kind of the main like Pandora's class, which is kind of like the in the vein of like I don't know like the rec room and like the freaking plant in Simpsons, like that's kind of the grounding for our main characters in a lot of ways. And there it's like with everyone that can kind of interact in some that like I definitely get the feeling of we're going to see them a lot more. They might even like become in like stories the main part. It's just that as of now, it's just good to just have them as like either side or either in the side or just if they need to be there for the joke, we'll have them.
Exactly. It's when constructing like backgrounds, I was like, okay, I need to actually settle on some set designs. Mainly because it's just anytime I see a crowd in that particular area, those characters will be there instead of having the new design every time. And then from that going like, well, and also it leaves the door open for them being used as things.
Oh no, like absolutely. Where it's like at the very least, they're just a good design to have in the back if you want to kind of like flesh out. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Where it's like I do like how a lot of the time it's not just like the background is empty. It's not just the whole thing where the background is empty. There's nothing there. It's just these weird sets. It's like these are actually lived in. You see people talking, interacting with each other. That's kind of what I noticed, where it's like it's not just going to devolve into just like set and then you have the characters. It's like, no, we're gonna have things happening in the back that can be gags or just there for like visual.
Oh yeah, anytime there's a very like large scene, I like to have
Like to fill it out,
attention.
essentially. That's what I was gonna say. Like fill it out to kind of like add in a bunch of stuff where it's not just like the main center point and then the rest is vacant, as in it's like a sitcom, like the studio lot. Now it's like, no, this is like people are thriving. Like especially in like the large, when it is like a big room, you definitely get that element of everything is moving. And too, like a lot of like visual gags and like side jokes that are not the focus but are like in the frame you do see. That's another thing I did notice while like reading it.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, like with those, is there like, do you have like, is it just something that comes to mind while you're drawing it, or like,
For me, when it comes to like with the large things, I kind of just let my mind go on them. A lot of it's a case where it's if it feels a little too blank, what could I add in here, and what would be a funny either like reference or gag, or maybe have like, instead of just this character just standing there, maybe have them doing something that's just weird and inexplicable. Like, one of the very earliest panels is like, Slender Man mowing his lawn, just funny little things like that.
well, yeah, that's what I meant. I was like, I wonder if it was just a case of while you were drawing it, these just came to you as like a gag, and like to fill it out, it fit.
Yeah, pretty much. There's not a lot of thought put to it. Just what can I add here, and just kind of let my mind go.
Absolutely, yeah. That's kind of what I kind of picked up myself, like visually, that element of just like adding in more, so it's not just nothing. And I do think you get some good ones. Like I admit, my personal favorite of these is still how in Ridley's room, the Sonichu poster, because it's something that when I clocked it, because it was kind of on a reread, I noticed it. I was like, what? And then I just burst out laughing of like, it kind of is just perfect.
It's yeah. You're what we're saying. The Sonichu picture was one of the ones that again, considering that the main focus of the moment will be it worked, and that you have to look for it. It's kind of in like an off, like shaded area. You can't fully see it. But Ridley's room in particular, there's always a changing poster.
Yeah.
And if you can tell what it is, like kudos to you, because it's like roving like cheesy horror movie posters. Like I had like Rubber was when they're the horror movie about a killer tire. But there's other times where it'll be like the Chris Chan one, or like one I'll make up myself. Like one of the ones he had on the wall once was like a joke horror movie called Fiddler Off the Roof. He's always has a fun one to mess around with.
I mean, I was gonna say, like, it's not so much the like in the room, but like the poster for the second issue. I think it's meant to be a reference to the Dracula's poster, the original one from 31. I think.
What now?
It's the cover of issue 2. I think it's meant to be modeled off of Dracula's original poster from 31.
As far as the cover of meant to reference a specific one, I just wanted it to look like an old like 30s movie poster. I love the style of those old posters. So admittedly, I don't think I'll ever do that again because the style is very difficult to get correct and have it look right. I like when they come out, but it takes a lot of time and effort. But yeah, that was just kind of its own thing, just to mimic that style.
It's fine. It's more of just like when I first saw it, there's one poster that was like right when it came out in 31 that it reminded me of, which I forget which specifically, but there's one. Well, I was going to say, with like that one is the Christian, the Sonichu poster is my personal favorite in that it's just the case of it's a funny. I love jokes in comedy where it's already a funny visual, but then thinking about it critically, it becomes funnier, and that the logic of it adds.
Yeah.
And it's
why
just
is it there exactly?
It's the epitome of, okay, it's already funny to have like a Sonichu reference as just a post you have up as like a standard comic book or a band. It becomes funnier in that, okay, does Ridley like Sonichu? Is Sonichu a thing? Does Chris Chan exist in you? It's a case of the more you think about it, the funnier it gets, as in what the fuck is the joke?
Yeah, or does he just have some weird power that just changes when it feels like according to the moods?
I mean, like in terms of the more like obvious joke side, like there is of course the Chris Central where it's like that's already a funny visual as is, and like especially if you know Chris Chen lore, it becomes funnier. But then it's like, okay, how did that thing show up to begin with? And I mean, there are less like jokey characters. Like there's that one like frame of like it's I forget their names, but it's like one's like a fly guy, one's like a voodoo doll, where it's like it's just thinking about how
Oh,
they ended up like that like I think it'd be very funny.
oh yeah, the when you have to sit and watch, because it kind of depends on how they died. What
Mhm.
I said, as far as the with the continuity, what creatures they are depend on how they die. So it's like, what what led them to becoming this in the afterlife?
Yeah, exactly. Like that's what a lot of designs was fun of kind of how like it's either a case of it makes complete sense and it's very obvious how they ended up like that, and then it's like I know what you are. What happened before this? That's like okay, that's how you ended up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is it a case of where you'll like? I feel like if I can wonder if it's a case of like either you just draw up the design and then you fill out the details of how it happened, or is it just a case of like you think of the idea and then you draw it from there?
It depends upon the character. There's some I have, other ones I just kind of draw. And within High School Party, there's like two different kinds of creatures. You can either have like undead creatures like Ridley, and they've just always been that way. There's just inexplicable, just entities, so they can kind of be whatever. And then there's the people who are actually deceased, and what how they died has caused that. So sometimes it can just be the whole, I don't know, they were always that way. If I can't think of anything, but other times it'll be like, okay, creative, how would they, and it can also lead me into like funny ideas. Like Colic was one that I just kind of drew, and then later on, like ended up having to figure out, okay, what caused him to be like this.
Well, no, yeah, definitely. I get that element of either. It's funny that there's a reasoning which is very strange and weird comparison, but it kind of reminds me of the portrait ghost in the first Luigi's Mansion, where they have profiles where they straight up like just go into detail about how they actually ended up dead. Or it's
Yes.
just a case of like there is no explanation. We're just going to leave it at that, and that's what's funny because it's like okay, it's just funny to ponder what made this being in specifics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, that's like with a lot of designs, kind of what stuck with me and what kind of makes a lot of them like funny. Of like either way, it can be very like it's very funny. And I mean, I guess I wonder too, kind of with all of that, where like when it comes to writing it, like, do you feel like you're kind of less when it comes to writing it? Is it ever a case of you still look back on these experiences in high school to kind of model it, or is it just a case of like, you know what, if it's funny, I'm going to use it?
It really, again, it depends very much on the current
Yeah.
one that I'm working on. Was always intended like, okay, this is going to be delving off of it, an experience that I had, and some of that, stupid thing. And the first one had a little bit of that too, but sometimes it's just a case of like the whole pants referencing with Miss Pandora. It just kind of ended up. I was like, I need a scene, we need a segue into their class. What should she be doing? Okay, she'll be doing something crazy weird, and then that kind of came to me like, oh, okay, it really depends.
Yeah, no, that kind of makes sense to me. Of like, I feel like at this point, again, with as much as like a lot of it comes from stuff you've lived through, a lot of it is also just like what would just be fun for these characters to go through.
Exactly, and if it works into an experience I had, then so be it.
I mean, too, I would say another thing I really love about the comic is just the number of like side mini kind of like almost shorts you do, where it's less of it's a lot of them come for like holidays, like Halloween and Christmas and all that. I like those ones
Mm-hmm.
just in the vein of like they remind me of almost like if we're talking like old cartoons like Nickelodeon Cartoon Network, they'll have like those promos where they'll have them just like getting up the shenanigans and it's like shorts
Yes.
they'll play it before or after that's kind of like an appetizer. And it kind of gives me that same vibe of like these feel like promos that would be for like holidays and all that.
Yeah. I always found that those were.
Yeah, like especially the ones where it's like a full on like short. It's almost again, it's a short. It's not so much as like a one panel. It's like a couple of them where it's kind of playing into like these gags, which are very much based in the character's dynamic.
They're fun to do too because it allows. Unfortunately, my progress on the comics is fairly slow, so sometimes it allows me to just kind of away from the. If I'm getting tired of the story, I can cut away and just do something funny or a joke I really want to do, but I'm not really sure realistically when I'll be able to get to that point. I can kind of have this joke now, and still kind of get it out there, and if it's an idea maybe I have, or it didn't fit for a full story, but I can get it out here. It's kind of a fun excuse to do something like that.
Oh no, like absolutely. Like I feel like in the way that it is like written, it definitely feels like you exercising like these characters like being active. Like my personal favorite of them off the top of my head is the one where it's Pequeña asking like what happened to like why does no one celebrate Halloween, where it's kind of a funny gag of like in this universe, what would happen to cause that to happen? And that it's such a specific reasoning that's weirdly grounded that makes it funny of like, this is so absurd, it shouldn't have it, but it does, and that's just funny.
Yeah, that was one I still I don't top. I just find it funny. It's like it's another case too of, and also if you really, it kind of if not offensive, at least really lame if everyone is actually just those creatures. Like Halloween really would be boring.
Yeah, like to me, what makes it funny is just the idea of how, like, okay, it sounds cool to celebrate Halloween, the Land of Dead, but at that point, it's like that's just celebrating Human Day. Like everybody
Exactly.
is like that, and it's just like, okay, that's just every Tuesday. It kind of just becomes really lame if you treat it as like in the world.
And
Um,
it was birthed purely of the whole like it's Halloween, I should do a Halloween thing. How do I do a Halloween thing? And it was just purely born thing is Halloween themed.
yeah, no, exactly. Where it's just like the joke is just like what can be done with this and just playing to, oh yeah, it's not a thing, and like why would it be? Because again, that would be like in our world having a human day where it's celebrating the wonders of humanism. It's just very strange.
My favorite Chocula, Frankenberry, and Booberry being extremely triggered by the trick-or-treaters dressed up as a Frankenstein vampire and ghost, and he tells them get their intolerant asses off of
I
his
mean,
property.
what that one, okay, that one is funny and just playing into how like, okay, in this world these like, a, it implies that these guys exist but are basically just like actors, like they're just like normal people, that's their job. B, it's also just funny, it's like, well, to be fair, if I'm like, if someone shows up at my house dressed up as me asking me for free candy, I probably have to be like, get the fuck out of here, little weirdo.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's like the joke comes just like that like being somewhat a thing that would happen and just being like, why are you doing this?
Especially too that sugary cereal. So not only like their species, but they're also asking for like candy. So it's like it's extra offensive.
Well, it's also just like, well, yeah, they also basically peddle candy that's somehow made into a kid thing. So it's just like, exactly.
It would be like someone showing up on like Italian step dressed fully as like an Italian chef asking for pasta on Halloween. Like, okay, get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, that's what makes it funny. Where it's like, it's just the joke of like a fucking course that would be the reaction. Like this, you think this would go well? No, they called you like a weird racist.
Yeah, like what the hell? Get out of here.
Well, then too, it also just plays into the whole joke of like, you thought that was a good like Halloween costume. What's wrong with you? Of course, people will get mad at that, but just in the most like silly version of that.
I also the witch, skeleton, and devil, and they pull off the mask, and they are witch, skeleton, and devil. And like, I feel so empty.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, there's nothing to celebrate because this is just everyday life. Like you're just dressing up as yourself. It would be like selling like Halloween costumes of just working office guy, working office girl, and it's the most drab generic outfits ever, where it's all just gray.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just like, and too, like I do like how like even when it's not the comic itself, like you're very active with like art of like holidays and just art you do of just these characters like and again, it adds to it feeling very lived in. Like, one of the things I really appreciate about it as a comic is that, yes, it's very cartoony, it's very over the top, it's very silly, but it's not just complete farce. It's grounded as in, like, you can imagine these guys just having a normal life. Like, these guys have lives outside of the issues, and that this is just the stuff to get up to.
Exactly.
And I just feel like, too, like, the way that they're all, like, composed as characters, I also just like the fact that it plays very much into just, like, they just hang out a lot. Like, of course, not every hangout is going to be drawn, but this is just some of the stuff to get up to.
Exactly.
Like, one I like a lot is the one where it's like you redrawing your first drawing of them from a while back, of just like the opposite, where the original drawing is good, but it's very like simple, and you can tell it's at the beginning of like you as an artist. And then the one now where it's very vibrant, very colorful, very detailed, and it's kind of almost exaggerating how much these designs have like grown. Even with Quentin, because with that one with Quentin, like, Saber Quentin as design has been very refined as a whole. Like, when you look at him, like, there's a lot of detail and elements added where it's not just like the basic kind of sketch it began as.
Yeah. Quentin find. I was just agreeing. I was like, he's more or less the same, overall look, but he definitely has increase in his spine.
Exactly. That's kind of what I was sort of thinking of just like taking these designs and just adding them more as you develop as an artist, where like now they are kind of fully complete. Like, now they're very layered, and you can do a lot more than just the original kind of sketches they began as. Which also to kind of add into, just it feels like with this is really developed from just like simple drawings to a very layered story that has a lot going on in it.
Yes.
No, yeah, like, and I just feel like too, like, just I mean, just related, like, if you kind of had to, like, what are some of your, as this continues, if you ever had the chance, are there any other ideas with this project you'd like to explore? Like, any other sort of forms of, like, art or content that you would not be against doing if you had the chance?
As far as with High School Death Party?
Yes.
To be perfectly honest, High School Death Party is a case of, I've always pictured it animated more than a comic. I don't really have the time to do an animation of it, but if ideally, I would love it to be an animated series. Mainly because, I've always pictured it as an animated series. I had there's a lot of scenes where I can picture them animated. I know what they're supposed to be doing at this moment, and it makes it to me. Also, to hearing their voices. Voices to me are much, as funny as the lines can be. It's hearing makes them funnier. So
go on.
If I was ever able to, it would be that I would want it to be an animated. There's also been my head of doing it at like having a like point and click adventure game of it would be a lot of fun. It would work in that kind of world. For the most part, I would really just like to do it as an anime.
I mean, like, with both of those are ones that I definitely can see where, like, with the animated thing, like, this, I'll say this, it feels very fluent for a comic. Like, you definitely get the element of, like, this is meant to be put in motion, but it still works just drawn out, and with a lot of the characters, like, the gags work both written and out of it, where, I mean, I also feel like there must have been a lot of, like, comics and graphic novels that this was kind of molded off of, like, this was kind of taking from those. And then with the point and click, like, this definitely gives me the element of a world that feels lived in enough to, like, explore. Like, I definitely see where you're coming from, of, like, these are characters where there is a lot of, like, gags you have on the back and a lot of interaction, and, like, you bump into them a lot. Like, I can definitely see this being a point and click in the vein of, like, say, Sam and Max, for example.
Definitely that. I was just agreeing, very much Sam and Max kind of that. Sam and Max, Monkey Island kind of thing.
Classic point and click from the 90s and all that.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a trial for me trying to convert my ideas from being animated into a comic, which is kind of why I go more like storyboard method in making it. It more fits how I'm viewing the series, and probably also why it takes a while to get done, because I'm viewing them in like kind of full like 20-minute or 30-minute like chunks, and so it kind of makes them take a little. It is what it is. So long as it gets some and I enjoy it. Someone else does it.
No, like I'm not saying it as an issue. I'm more just saying it as in like
Oh, sure.
I definitely see where you're coming from, and I can see that it's more of just like if it ever arises, I'm interested to see like where you are going to kind of take this project. And I mean, like
Sure.
we're still on, of course, the second issue. There's still way much more to come. It's
Mhm.
more of just like as of now where it kind of can go. But again, like
Yeah.
I'm very interested to see like the. I mean, of course, this comic is still like the issue is still going on to see kind of what's next in store.
Mhm, mhm.
I mean, if I can just kind of say, because I admit, I kind of feel like we've kind of got the general idea down. Like, is there anything else you want to bring up before we call it up? Or
No, not that I can
well,
right now.
no, yeah.
I'm
In that
oh,
case,
just
I
saying.
think. Sorry. Go on. Yeah.
No. I was just saying, it's like as far as issue 2 is still ongoing, and I honestly don't know where issue 3 will go, but I'll figure that out whenever I get to it. So
All good. Thank you so much. I feel like I kind of ran through everything I wanted to say. I'm very excited to see what comes up. And yes, thank you. So have a nice
no problem.
have a nice one,
All
everybody.
right.